The torches cut the black timber like open wounds. 6 riders climbed the frozen road, leather creaking, breath white in the cold. The mountain did not sleep. Something waited in the trees. A birch leaned, groaned. Then the first horse screamed and went down hard into the snow. Riders cursed. Torches scattered. A second shape dropped from the dark. Another, Steele whispered. From the cabin window, a rifle barrel steadied. A warning shot cracked the night. Then a real one. The road went quiet for half a heartbeat, long enough to hear the next set of hooves still coming. Cinder Gulch, Montana Territory, winter 1882. The cold came down off the tobacco root, range like it had a grudge to settle. Amos Judd felt it in his knuckles first, then his jaw, then that old place behind his ribs where he kept the 8 years. He was splitting wood when the wind changed direction. Just like that. No warning. The axe came down, and the log split clean, and he stood there a second too long, listening to something that wasn't there. Wind, he told himself. Just wind. Except it wasn't. Not really. It was the sound a cradle makes when nobody's rocking it anymore. He knew that sound too well. He'd made it himself, 3 winters back. The night he split the cradle for kindling, because he could not look at it one more day. He picked up another log, set it on the stump, swung. The cabin behind him sat low against the mountain, chinked with mud gone gray, a single window fogged, with the breath of a fire he'd let die twice already this week. He wasn't proud of that. He wasn't much of anything these days. Just a man who woke up and worked and did not think, because thinking was the one thing that could still put him on the floor. 8 years. 8 winters since Rebecca. 8 winters since the boy who never got a name passed. The one his mother whispered to him twice, before the fever took them both, in the same terrible hour. Amos standing at the foot of the bed with a tin cup of water nobody needed anymore. He remembered the smallest things about that hour, and none of the large ones. He remembered the particular way the lamp had guttered on the sill. He remembered that Rebecca's hand had been warmer than his own, right up until it wasn't. He did not remember, could never afterward remember, the exact moment either of them had stopped breathing. His mind had simply refused to keep that piece of film. Some mercy in that, he supposed, though it had never once felt like mercy at the time. He'd buried them on the ridge above the cabin because he couldn't stand the thought of them lying anywhere he couldn't see, which meant he saw that ridge every single morning, which meant every single morning, before he'd even had his coffee, grief was already standing there, waiting for him like a debt collector who never took a day off. He remembered, too, standing there with the axe still loose in his hand, the particular way Rebecca used to hum while she worked the garden that had once grown, badly even then, along the south wall of the cabin. She'd never had much of a voice for singing proper, and she'd known it, and she'd done it anyway, unbothered, the same way she'd done most things in her short life, not because she was especially gifted at them, but because she'd decided the doing of a thing mattered more than the doing of it well. He missed that about her some mornings more than he missed anything else. Not her face exactly, though he missed that too. In the way a man misses a photograph, he no longer quite trusts his memory to have gotten right. He missed the particular, ordinary sound of another person moving through a life alongside his own, unbothered by how badly either of them did any of it, so long as they kept doing it together. He finished the wood. He stacked it against the north wall where the snow wouldn't bury it by February. He went inside and built the fire back up because a man had to eat something besides beans out of a dented pot. Even a man who'd stopped caring what he ate about 4 years ago. The mule watched him through the gap in the lean-to. As he crossed the yard, her ears swiveling with the mild disapproval she seemed to reserve especially for him. She was old. Older than she had any right to still be standing, Doc Whitfield had told him once, half in jest. Amos had bought her the same spring he'd buried Rebecca and the boy, because a man needed something alive to be responsible for, even if he could not yet stand to be responsible for himself. He stood in the middle of his own cabin, and he looked at the empty corner by the window where nothing was, where nothing had been for a long time, and he said out loud, to no one, "I need to hear a voice that isn't mine." His own words surprised him. He hadn't planned to say them. But there they were, hanging in the cold air of the cabin, and he found he could not take them back, and he found he did not want to. So he saddled the mule. He told himself the way he always told himself, that he needed flour, that he needed lamp oil, and a new file for the axe, and coffee, because the tin he'd been rationing since November, had gone thin enough to see light through. All of that was true enough. None of it was the real reason, and he knew it wasn't, even as he counted his coin into the leather pouch and tied it shut. $11 and change. The whole of what he had in the world that wasn't nailed to a fence post or growing, badly, in frozen ground. Damn fool, he thought, swinging up into the saddle. Going to town on a night like this for flour you don't need yet. Except he was going anyway. The ride down into Cinder Gulch took the better part of 3 hours, the mule picking her way through drifts with the patient stubbornness of an animal, who had made this trip more times than her rider had bothered to count. Amos didn't talk to her. He wasn't a man who talked to animals, not out loud, not most days. But he rode with his collar up and his hands buried and his mind doing the thing it always did on this road, which was replaying a life he no longer had, frame by frame, like a man picking at a scab, because the pain, at least, was proof he could still feel something. Because that was the thing nobody told you about grief. Nobody told you it would get quiet. Nobody told you the quiet was worse than the noise, until you were the one standing in it. He passed the split-rail fence, where Rebecca had once hung washed to dry, in weather far too cold for it to have dried at all, simply because she liked the way the sheets looked, frozen stiff and white against the timber. He passed the bend in the creek, where he'd taught himself to fish badly the first summer they'd homesteaded here, young and certain the mountain owed them something. He passed all of it the way a man passes his own reflection in dark glass, aware of it, and unable to stop seeing it, and unwilling to look away either. The town came up out of the dark the way it always did. A smear of lamplight against blue-black mountains. Cinder Gulch wasn't much of a town. Never had been. A livery. A general store run by a Dane named Peterson, who cut his flour with sawdust and thought nobody noticed. A sheriff's office that saw more dust than deputies. A church that held services twice a month when the circuit preacher remembered the road existed. And the broken spur, which was where every soul in the territory who had nowhere better to be eventually ended up, one way or another. Amos hitched the mule outside Peterson's first, more out of habit than intention, and stood a moment on the boardwalk, looking at the lit windows of the saloon 2 doors down. He could still turn around, could still buy his flour, his oil, his coffee, and ride home before the whiskey ever touched his tongue. He did not turn around. He went inside. The smell hit him the way it always did. Tobacco thick enough to chew. Wet wool. Whiskey gone sour in the bottom of 100 glasses. A stove burning too hot in the corner, the way stoves in saloons always burned, like heat could make up for everything else that was wrong with the room. A handful of familiar faces looked up as he passed, and looked back down again, just as quick. Because that was the particular courtesy Cinder Gulch extended to Amos Judd these days, enough acknowledgement to prove they hadn't forgotten he existed, not enough to invite him into whatever conversation was already underway. He didn't mind it. Had come to prefer it, if he was honest. The last 8 years having taught him that most conversation asked more of a man than he had readily available to give. He made his way to the bar. The keep, a narrow man named Dooley with a scar tugging one corner of his mouth permanently south, slid a glass across without being. Judd. Dooley, mule still breathing for now. That's about all any of us can claim. Amos drank. The whiskey tasted like kerosene wearing a whiskey costume. It burned going down, and that was, more or less, the entire point. Quiet in here tonight, he said, mostly to have something to say. Give it an hour. Dooley wiped a glass that didn't need wiping. There's a card game starting up back of the room. Drifter come through this afternoon looking to make his fortune off men who ought to know better. Amos didn't turn to look. Wasn't his business. He drank his second glass slower than the first, letting the heat of it spread through his chest, and thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest thing to peace he ever got these days. The space between thoughts. He was on his second glass when the noise from the back of the room changed. Not louder, different. The particular hush that falls over a crowd right before something goes wrong. Amos had heard that hush before. In saloons. In church the day of the funeral, when the whole congregation had gone quiet at once, like they'd all realized together that there was nothing left to say. He turned around. The poker table sat under a lamp that swayed every time the door opened. 4 men. Amos knew 2 of them. Cyrus Pratt, who ran the livery and cheated at cards the way other men breathed without thinking about it. A young cattle hand named Gill, who looked, as he always did, one bad hand away from tears. A heavy-set stranger in a banker's coat sweat, rings under both arms despite the cold. And the fourth man. Amos didn't know his name yet, wouldn't for another few minutes. But he knew the type on sight, the way you know weather is coming before the first cloud shows. Lean, restless eyes that moved even when his head stayed still. 2 pistols on his belt, which was one more than any honest man needed on a Tuesday. And behind him, on the floor, against the wall, sat a woman. Her wrists were bound in front of her with a length of rope gone dark with wear. Her dress had been some pale color once. Now it was the color of a thing dragged through every kind of weather a Montana winter had to offer. Her hair hung loose and matted around a face turned down toward her own bound hands, like she was studying them, like she wasn't sure anymore that they belonged to her. Amos's glass stopped halfway to his mouth, because there was something about the stillness of her, not the stillness of someone waiting to see what happens next, the stillness of someone who had already stopped waiting. He set the glass down without finishing it. Been sitting there since noon, Dooley said low, following his gaze. Drifter won't say much about her. Says she's his. Says her name's Odessa, or near enough to it. Won't tell nobody where she come from. She eaten anything? Judd, what do you care? Amos didn't have an answer to that yet. He turned back to watch the table. The lean man was on his feet now, laughing the kind of laugh that had teeth in it. Called, he said. And I'm still standing here poorer than a church mouse. That so, Wicklow? So, Wicklow. That was his name. Wicklow shoved his chair back hard enough to scrape the floor. He looked around the saloon like the room itself had personally wronged him. One more hand, he announced. Anybody got the stomach? Winner takes the whole pot. The banker laughed. You ain't got nothing left to put in a pot, friend. I got her. Wicklow jerked a thumb over his shoulder without looking at her. Didn't even look. Like she was a saddle. Like she was a mule with a bad hip. The room went quiet in pieces. First the near table, then the bar, then the whole rotten length of the place, until Amos could hear the stove popping in the corner and his own pulse working in his ears. She's collateral, Wicklow said, grinning now, warming to the sound of his own voice. Bought her fair down in Cheyenne. Worth more than any coin on this table, if a man knew what to do with her. Which, I'll grant you, he glanced back at her finally, the way you'd glance at a piece of furniture you were tired of moving. Takes a particular kind of patience. She don't talk much. Don't eat much either. Big as she is, you'd think she'd eat more. Somebody at the bar snorted. Amos felt something shift under his sternum. Not heat exactly. Not the kind of anger that made a man reckless. Something colder than that. Something that had been asleep so long he almost didn't recognize it when it opened its eyes. Because that was the part that did it. Not the rope, not the sail. The joke. The way the man had made her size into an insult before he'd made her a wager. Like it was funny. Like the room owed him a laugh for it. Nobody was laughing at Rebecca. Some old voice in the back of his skull whispered, unbidden, unwelcome. This isn't Rebecca. He knew that. Of course he knew that. Rebecca had been narrow as a fence rail and gone 8 years, and the woman on the floor was a stranger he'd known for the length of one bad joke. Except knowing it and feeling it were 2 different animals entirely. Because what he felt watching that woman's shoulders not move, not flinch, not react at all to being laughed at by a room full of strangers, was not really about Rebecca in particular. It was about every soul he'd ever watched get diminished by somebody too small themselves to leave well enough alone. It was about 8 years of watching his own worth get whittled down by his own grief until he'd nearly forgotten there was anything left of him worth keeping. He recognized that particular kind of erosion when he saw it happening to somebody else. That was the whole of it, if he was honest. He looked around the room while he thought it, taking stock of the faces turned toward Wicklow with easy amusement, none of them troubled in the slightest by what they were watching. Cyrus Pratt grinning, like he'd paid good money for the entertainment. The banker studying his own dwindling coin rather than the woman on the floor, unwilling to spend even a glance on a situation that cost him nothing to ignore. Gil the cattle hand, young enough still to look faintly sick about it, though not so young he'd found his voice to say anything against it. A whole room full of men who'd decided, without ever discussing it amongst themselves, that this particular cruelty didn't rise to the level worth interrupting their evening over. Amos had been one of those men himself, plenty of time these past 8 years. Had let plenty of things pass unremarked because remarking on them cost more of himself than he'd had spare to give. He understood the impulse to look away. He'd built a whole life on it. brick by careful brick, ever since the morning he'd buried Rebecca and the boy on that ridge, and decided the safest way through the remainder of his own life was to feel as little of it as he could manage. "Anybody?" Wicklow called out again, louder. "One man in this whole territory with the sand for one more hand?" Nobody answered. The woman didn't move, didn't look up. Her hands stayed folded, still, in her lap, and Amos watched them the way a man watches weather he can't yet name. And he thought, and this was the part he could never fully explain to himself later, not that night, not any night after he thought, she isn't even hoping anymore. Something in him moved before his mind gave permission. "I'll play." He didn't remember deciding to say it. The words simply arrived, and then the whole saloon was looking at him, and Wicklow was looking at him too, smiling now in a way that never once touched his eyes. "Well," Wicklow said, "look what the mountain sent us. You heard me. How much you carrying, old-timer?" Amos was 38. He didn't feel it was worth mentioning that 38 wasn't old. Not tonight. Tonight he felt every one of Wicklow's insults land somewhere close to true. $9, Emma said. Wicklow laughed, short and ugly. $9. Against a grown woman. You hear that, boys? You set the price, Emma said. Not me. That took the smile down a quarter-inch. Wicklow studied him a beat longer than he had before, some small recalculation happening behind his eyes. The look of a man realizing the evening had just turned into something other than what he'd planned. Sit then. 5 card draw. 1 hand. Amos sat. Cyrus Pratt leaned back in his chair with the particular satisfaction of a man who suspected he was about to watch something interesting happen to somebody else. The banker gathered what little remained of his coin and made himself smaller, the way men do when they sense the air in a room has changed and want no part of what comes next. Gil the cattle hand just stared wide-eyed, somewhere between the woman on the floor and the 2 men, now facing each other across warped pine. Amos did not look at her. Could not look at her, because if he looked at her, he was afraid he'd do something even more foolish than what he was already doing, and he had a feeling he was going to need every scrap of foolish he could find before this hand played out. Dooley brought a fresh deck. Wicklow shuffled the way a man shuffles who has shuffled for a living, which was not, in Amos's experience, ever a comforting sign. Cut, Wicklow said. Amos cut. Cards slid across warped pine. Amos didn't touch his right away. He sat with both hands flat on either side of them, and made himself breathe slow, because a man's face was his first weapon at a table like this, and his face had gotten very good these past 8 years, at giving nothing away. He picked the cards up, a pair of kings, a jack, a 4, a 7. He kept his eyes fixed on Wicklow like Wicklow was a fence post. Nothing more interesting than that. Cards? 3. He set down the jack, the 4, the 7. Wicklow dealt them back one at a time, slow, the way a man deals when he wants somebody to feel every card land. Amos picked them up. 3rd king, a 6, 4th king, 4 of a kind. He did not blink, did not breathe different. He set the cards face down against his stomach and let his heart do whatever it needed to do on the inside, where nobody could see it. Dealer takes 2, Wicklow said, and dealt himself a pair. He looked at them. Something small moved at the corner of his mouth, a tightening no wider than a hair. Amos saw it and did not smile, though something in him wanted to. Everything I got's in, Wicklow said, and shoved his coin forward. And her. Amos agreed. He pushed his $9 into the center of the table. Call. Amos laid his hand down. 4 kings, neat as a row of soldiers standing at attention. The saloon went past quiet into something closer to held breath. Wicklow stared at the cards a long moment, long enough that his jaw worked once, twice, like he was chewing on something bitter. Then he laid his own hand down. 2 pair. Aces and 8s. Somebody at the bar let out a low whistle. Wicklow's hand, the one still holding the useless cards, closed slowly into a fist. Amos watched him and thought, here it comes. Here's where he reaches for one of those pistols. And every muscle in Amos's body went cold and ready in a way it hadn't been in years. But Wicklow didn't reach. He stood up slow, instead, and stared down at Amos across the table, and his voice came out, low and tight as wire. Take her then. She ain't worth much anyway. Won't hardly speak, won't hardly eat, though you wouldn't know it to look at her. He spat on the floor and turned for the door, and the door banged shut behind him hard enough to rattle every bottle behind the bar. For one long second, nobody spoke. Then Cyrus Pratt started laughing, and the banker started laughing, and pretty soon half the room was laughing. At Amos, at Wicklow, at the whole absurd business of it, And Amos sat very still in his chair and let it wash over him and felt his jaw tighten and did not say a word back to any of it. "Well, Judd," Pratt hollered, wiping his eyes, "you've gone and bought yourself a wife. Hope she cooks." Somebody else called. "Hope she don't talk your ear off," a third voice added, and the whole room found that particularly funny given everything they'd just witnessed of her silence. Amos stood. He gathered his coin. He crossed the saloon slow and steady toward the woman, still sitting against the wall. She hadn't looked up once through the whole hand. He crouched down in front of her, knees popping the way a man's knees will at 38 when the cold has gotten into them proper. He set his hat on the floor beside him. "Ma'am." "Nothing. My name's Amos Judd, live up the mountain, about 3 hours north of here." He paused. "I just won you in a hand of cards, which I'd like you to know is the single most foolish thing I've done in 8 years, and I am only about halfway through being foolish about it." A muscle moved at the corner of her jaw, small. "But there, I'm going to cut that rope," he said. "And then I'm going to ask you if you want to ride up the mountain with me. It's just a cabin. Ain't much to look at, but it's warm, and there's food, and nobody up there is going to put a rope on you ever again. If you don't want to come, you don't have to. I won you, so he couldn't have you anymore." That's all this was. Her eyes came up. It was the first time he'd seen them proper. Gray. The particular gray of sky right before a hard rain comes down. Green working underneath it if you look close enough. And they were not empty. He'd have sworn, from across the room, there was nothing left in them. Up close, he saw he'd been wrong. There was something in there. Small. Banked down low, like a coal buried in ash, waiting on somebody to bother stirring it. She looked at him a long moment. Then she nodded. One nod. That was all. Amos let a breath go he hadn't known he was holding. He drew his pocket knife and sawed through the rope. It had been tight a long while. The skin underneath had gone raw and cracked. Dark rings pressed into her wrists like a brand. "Christ," he said before he could stop himself. "Pardon?" Her voice when it came was hoarse. Unused. But clear underneath the rust of it. Clear and plain and, he noted with some surprise, entirely unafraid. "Nothing, ma'am." He shrugged out of his own coat and held it open. "Going to be too big," he said. "That's all right. You'll want it for the ride." She didn't say yes, didn't say no either. But when he held the coat out, she stood slow, careful, like someone testing whether the floor could be trusted to stay where it was, and let him settle it around her shoulders. It swallowed her whole, sleeves hanging well past her hands, hem brushing her shins. He glanced around the room. Every eye in the place was on him. Pratt was still grinning ear to ear. "Boys," Amos said, "I'll see you around." "Hope she don't murder you in your sleep, Judd," Pratt called after him, and half the room laughed again. "I expect that's between me and her," Amos said, and walked her out into the cold. The ride up the mountain took most of the night. She didn't speak. Not when he stopped the mule at the turn in the road to let the old girl breathe. Not when the notch in the trees came into view, and he pointed and said, "That's it, just past there." Not when they came down into the little hollow where the cabin sat, dark and crooked against the snow, one window glowing faint orange from a fire he'd banked low before he left. He felt her shivering against him. Small tremors she was clearly trying to keep contained, and he did not remark on it, because remarking on it felt like it might embarrass her, and embarrassing her was the very last thing he intended to do tonight. She didn't speak when he helped her down. Speak when he opened the door and stepped back to let her go in first. She walked to the middle of the room and stopped. And Amos, standing in the doorway with the cold at his back, watched her look for reasons he could never afterward explain, because he had told no one, had shown no one, watched her look straight at the empty corner by the window, the one that held nothing, the one that had once held a cradle. Her shoulders rose, fell, once deep. He shut the door behind them both. "There's stew," he said, moving to the stove, needing something to do with his hands. "Ain't good, but there's some." He ladled it into a tin bowl, set it on the table with a spoon, pulled the one chair out and turned it toward her. "Eat," he said. "Or don't. I'm going to sit over here and not look at you." He settled on the floor by the fire, back against the wall, and made a great show of studying the flames like they held some urgent secret. After a long moment he heard the chair scrape, heard the spoon meet the bowl, tentative at first, then less tentative. He did not turn around. He listened to her eat, and somewhere in the listening his eyes went wet, and he wiped them quick with the back of his hand, because there was no one there to see. And that was the first crying he'd done since the second winter after Rebecca. When the bowl was empty, he heard the spoon set down. "Thank you," she said. First words, her voice steadier now. Plain. Underneath the rust of disuse, there was something almost cultured in it. Some careful shape to the vowels that didn't belong to a woman who'd spent weeks sleeping on saloon floors. "You're welcome, ma'am." He kept his eyes on the fire. "My name is Odessa," she said. "Odessa Marsh. Pleased to know it." The fire popped. Outside, the wind worked itself against the cabin and went off somewhere else to argue. "Mr. Judd." "Amos is fine, Amos." A pause, like she was testing the shape of his name, the way she'd been testing the shape of her own voice. "Why did you do that?" He didn't answer right away, because he didn't have a good answer. Because the true answer that a man had made a joke of her size, and Amos had felt something in himself he hadn't felt in 8 years, something that wanted badly to make that man wrong, wasn't the kind of answer a person handed a stranger on the first night. "Seemed like the thing in front of me to do," he said finally. "Didn't think much past that. That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She was quiet a while. Then softer, "Thank you for not laughing." He didn't know what to say to that. So he didn't say anything at all. He got up, fetched 2 blankets from the chest at the foot of his own narrow bed and laid a pallet by the fire. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll be over here." Door bars from the inside. "You bar it if you want. Won't take it. Personal." She watched him a long moment. "I don't think I need to," she said. "Bar it anyway. Tonight you bar it." She did. He heard the wooden bar slide home, soft, and he lay down on the cold pine floor and stared up at the rafters and listened, for the first time in 8 years, to the sound of another person breathing in the same room. He didn't know it yet. Couldn't have known it, lying there with the wind arguing at the eaves. But the woman sleeping behind that barred door was about to walk out onto his dead field at first light and look at his frozen, rock-choked, useless scrap of mountain ground, the way a doctor looks at a patient everyone else has already given up burying. And what she carried in her head, what nobody in Cinder Gulch, nobody in the whole territory, nobody who had laughed at Amos Judd that night, had the first idea she carried, was going to change more lives than his before that year was through. But that was tomorrow's trouble. Tonight, the fire burned low and the snow kept coming down, and 2 strangers slept under the same roof for the first time in either of their lives. She was already gone when he woke. That was the first thing he noticed. Not the cold. Not the gray light pushing through the frost on the window. The empty bed, blanket folded neat across the foot of it. Not thrown back, folded. The way somebody folds a thing when they were raised to leave a place better than they found it. He was on his feet and reaching for his coat before he'd fully decided to move. He found her out past the cabin, in the field, if a man was feeling generous enough to call it a field, which in Amos's darker moods he was not. 3 years running, he'd tried to grow something on that stretch of rock-studded ground behind the cabin. 3 years running it had refused him. She was crouched at the far end near the tree line, fingers buried in frozen dirt, still wearing his coat. Her bare feet, he'd forgotten about her feet entirely. God help him, were wrapped in strips of cloth she must have torn from somewhere and bound herself before ever stepping outside. Her hair was still a wreck. Her face still carried the grime of weeks on the road. But she knelt there in the gray first light, with her fingers sunk into his dead ground, studying it the way a person studies something they are seriously considering. Amos stood at the edge of the field. Coffee pot in hand, he'd grabbed it off the stove, mostly for something to occupy his fingers, and watched her. She moved slowly from one spot to the next, working her fingers into the soil, rubbing it between them, bringing it to her nose, actually smelling it. Eyes closed for a second, then open, then 6 feet over, and the whole strange ritual again. "You'll freeze without proper boots," he called. She looked up, didn't startle, which meant she'd already known he was there. "I know," she said. "Won't be much longer." He walked out to her, stopped a few feet off and looked at what she was doing. At the small holes where her fingers had gone in. At the dark-turned earth. He tried to see what she was seeing. He saw rock. He saw hard-packed dirt and the gray stubble of last year's failed crop, poking up through the snow like the bones of something that hadn't survived the winter either. "What do you see?" he asked. She sat back on her heels, wiped her hands on her ruined dress. "Potential," she said. "You see disappointment. I see clay. Heavy clay, which most men curse, but clay holds water that's not nothing. That's a start. Your drainage is wrong. Water pools in the center drowns the roots before they've had a chance to try. And this, she pressed her palm flat to the ground. This is acidic. Badly so. That's why whatever you planted here died before it ever had a fair fight. Amos looked at her. How do you know I planted anything? I can see the stalks. Barley, I'd guess, by the shape of the stubble. She glanced toward far corner. Barley hates acidic soil. So did whatever you tried the year before that. Turnips, he admitted. Year before, wheat. Wrong, wrong and wrong. She's slow, and turned to study the tree line, then turned back to him. Buckwheat would thrive here. Certain rye, two of the high-altitude strains. There are a few others. How do you know all that? Most farmers around here have spent their whole lives on this ground and still can't tell you why one field grows and the next one overdies. Because most farmers around here are guessing, she said, without any particular unkindness, simply stating it the way she seemed to state most things. They plant what their fathers planted, in the ground their fathers had, and when it fails they blame the weather, or bad luck, or a curse on the land, because those explanations don't require them to admit they never actually understood what they were working with in the first place. Soil isn't mysterious, Mr. Judd. It's just rarely listened to. She stopped herself. He watched something cross her face, some decision working itself out behind her eyes. Mr. Judd. Amos. Amos. She wrapped his coat tighter around her shoulders, and for a moment she looked less like a woman studying dirt and more like a woman about to hand over something she'd carried a long way and was afraid to put down. I should tell you something about myself before this goes any further. All right, my father was Elias Marsh. He held a position for 18 years at a college back east, studying soil, marginal land, ground everyone else had already written off as dead. The last 12 years of his life he spent traveling west, testing what he'd learned against real frontier ground instead of paper theories. She paused. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, the way a person's does when they're walking toward a memory they'd rather not enter but can't seem to avoid. He died 14 months ago. Fever. It was fast. I was with him. I'm sorry, after he died, I had his notes. Journals. Years of them. Packed in a case formulas, seed strains he'd bred himself, soil treatments built for short seasons and thin high ground. Her hands closed briefly into fists at her sides. I was traveling to Denver, to a man who'd worked alongside him once, hoping he might help me see the work published. Jed Wicklow found me 6 weeks outside of Casper. Amos went very still. He didn't know what he had. She went on, voice flattening the way a person's voice flattens when they're forcing themselves through something, without letting it show on their face. He thought the case held money, or something he could sell for money. When he opened it and found nothing but books, he was furious. He sold the case to a bookseller 2 towns later. He kept me. I don't know entirely why. I've had a great deal of time to wonder, and I've never landed on an answer that made any sense. Do you know the bookseller's name? A town called Larkspur Crossing. I heard him say it once, arguing with a man about the price. Then we'll write to Larkspur Crossing. She looked at him sharply. Something moved behind those gray eyes, small, startled, like an animal catching a sound it hadn't expected to hear twice in one lifetime. It isn't your problem, she said. Didn't say it was, Amos said. Said we'd write. She studied him another long moment. The wind came off the mountain and pushed a strand of matted hair across her face, and she did not move to brush it away. What I carry in my head is most of it, she said finally, looking back down at his field. The formulas, the methods I watched him work them for years, side by side, before he ever wrote a word down. I can't give you back his exact pages, but I can give you enough to make something grow here. She knelt again, took up a fistful of dirt, turned it slowly in her palm. If you'll let me try. Amos looked at his field. 3 years of failure sat in that ground, silent and stubborn as a debt that refused to age off the books. Ma'am, he said, I have not managed to grow one honest thing on this ground in 3 years of trying. It's cost me savings I didn't have to spare and hope I'd nearly stopped keeping track of. If you believe you can make something live here, I am the last man on this mountain who's going to stand in your way. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile, but it lived in the same neighborhood as one. I'll need supplies, she said. Limestone. To start a good deal of it to correct that acid before we plant anything at all. Seed and specific varieties, not whatever Peterson keeps rotting on his shelf. I'll write you a list, all right. It won't look like much for the first month. I've gotten used to things not looking like much. I mean, it will look worse before it looks better, she said, and something in her tone sharpened. Like she needed him to understand this part clearly before she agreed to anything else. There will be a stretch where the ground looks torn up and ruined, and you will want, very badly, to ask me what I've done. You'll have to trust the process even on the days it looks like I've ruined everything. Odessa. Her name came out of him a little clumsy the first time he'd used it, and he felt the clumsiness of it and didn't care. I'm a man going broke slow and quiet on this mountain, going broke faster, with a chance attached to it. Still beats the alternative I've been living. She stood, held the fistful of dirt, just held it, and looked out over the ugly frozen field, and Amos looked at it too, and tried and could not quite manage, but tried to see it the way she was seeing it. Thank you, she said. For last night. For all of it. I'd do it again, he said, and found, to his own faint surprise, that he meant it entirely. She nodded once and started back toward the cabin, wrapped feet leaving small, even, unhurried prints in the snow. Amos stood there another minute in the cold, looking at his ground, and then he followed her in. He found himself over those first strange days, doing small arithmetic he hadn't done in years, counting how much coffee two people drank instead of one, noticing that the cabin held heat different, with a second body moving through it, warmer in ways that had nothing to do with the stove. He caught himself, more than once, walking toward the empty corner by the window out of an old habit of avoidance, only to remember that the corner no longer sat quite so empty in his mind, not since a stranger's shoulders had risen and fallen there the very first night, taking some small measure of that particular grief and folding it into something he hadn't yet found a name for. It unsettled him some, how quickly his own habits had begun rearranging themselves around another person's presence. 8 years he'd built a life shaped entirely around absence meals for one, silence that filled every corner of every room, a cabin that had learned to echo in the particular way empty places learned to echo. And now, within the space of a handful of days, some of that echo had gone quiet, replaced by the ordinary sounds of somebody else simply existing nearby. A page turning, a boot scraping mud at the threshold, a low hum, unconscious, while she worked a problem over in her head. He did not examine too closely what he felt about that. Those first days, some things he'd learned went better, left unexamined till a man had the strength ready to meet whatever answer he found. Getting Odessa boots turned into its own small campaign, and it started with an argument neither of them expected to have. I don't need new things, she said the morning after, watching him pull on his coat. The dress will hold a while longer. I've made worse do for longer stretches than this. Dress is more whole than dress, Amos said. Seen scarecrows better dressed. That's not kind. Wasn't trying for kind. Trying for honest. He paused at the door. You keep telling me you don't need things, and I keep noticing you need most everything. Those two facts are going to keep bumping into each other until one of us gives. I don't take charity well. Wasn't offering charity. Offering wages, if it makes it sit easier. You've already saved me more in seed money than I've spent on you twice over, just by knowing which half of what I bought was worthless. He settled his hat. Call it a debt. I know you're partial to those. That got something close to a laugh out of her, small, surprised, gone almost before it arrived, like she wasn't yet sure she was allowed to keep it. Nothing in the cabin fit her. His own boots swallowed, her feet whole, comic in a way neither of them mentioned out loud. So 2 days later he rode back down alone and bought a proper pair from Peterson's. Peterson looked at the boots, and looked at Amos, and looked at the coin, and something calculating moved behind the man's pale eyes, before he wisely kept his mouth shut about all of it. Heard you won yourself a woman at cards, Peterson said anyway, because a man like Peterson could never quite manage to keep his mouth shut for long. That true? Won her freedom, Amos said. That's the truth of it if you're wanting one. Peterson didn't have a response ready for that. He wrapped the boots in brown paper and said nothing further, though Amos caught him watching through the window as he loaded the mule, and understood, without needing to be told, that this was the first small ripple of a story that was going to travel faster than he could outrun it. He carried the boots in himself and set the brown paper parcel on the table without a word, because he'd learned already that she took less offense at a thing quietly given than a thing loudly presented. She opened it slow and looked at the boots a long moment before she ever touched them, and something crossed her face that he didn't have a name for yet, though he'd come to recognize it plenty of times before this year was through. They fit, she said later, standing by the door, testing her weight in them the way a person tests ice before trusting it to hold. I don't think I've had a pair of boots that actually fit since before my father died. Peterson's got a decent eye for sizing, whatever else you might say about his flour. She was quiet a moment, looking down at her own feet like they belonged to a stranger she was still getting properly introduced to. "Thank you," she said, and it carried a different weight than the thanks she'd given him that first night, less startled, more settled. The thanks of a woman who was beginning, cautiously, to believe kindness might not always come with a cost attached to it. He bought what limestone one mule could reasonably haul and carried a list of seed varieties written out in Odessa's hand, careful and clean as something set in type. Peterson didn't have half of what was on the list. Amos wrote to a seed merchant in Bozeman and a supply house in Helena and waited on the mail the way a man waits when he's decided, against every habit of the last 8 years, to hope for something. The seed came in, over the following 2 weeks, in pieces, each time a delivery arrived. Odessa opened it at the kitchen table with a deliberateness that reminded him, oddly, of a surgeon laying out instruments before he'd ever cut anything. She held each packet to the light, cracked a few seeds between her fingers, smelled them. Some she nodded over and set aside. Others she frowned at and pushed away entirely. "These are old," she said of one batch. "Germination will be poor." "How poor?" "We plant twice as many. Space them tighter. We compensate for what the seed itself won't give us." She had a system for everything, and Amos, watching her work through those first weeks, began to understand slowly, the way understanding tends to arrive when a man's been alone too long to trust it quickly, that what she carried in her head wasn't only information. It was an entire way of looking at the world. She didn't fight the land the way most frontier farmers fought it, like an enemy to be beaten into submission by sheer stubbornness. She asked it questions first. She waited to hear the answer before she decided what to do about it. "Explain it to me proper," he said one afternoon, leaning on the plow handle to catch his breath, watching her test a fistful of turned earth between her fingers. "Not the short version you give the neighbors. The whole of it. I've got time, and I'd like to understand what I'm doing out here instead of just doing it because you told me to." She looked at him a moment, weighing whether he meant it, and seemed to decide he did. "Every plant needs 3 things from the ground it grows in," she said. "Water, which most farmers understand well enough. Nutrients, which most farmers understand poorly because they can't see them, and so they don't trust what they can't see. And structure, the actual physical shape of the dirt itself, how tightly it's packed, how well it lets roots push through it and air move down into it. Most men only ever think about the first 2. They water when it's dry and they manure when the ground looks tired, and they never once ask whether the dirt itself is built in a way that lets any of that help reach where it's needed. And this ground is heavy clay, which most men curse on sight because it's difficult to work. But clay isn't the enemy you all seem to think it is. Clay holds water and nutrients better than nearly any other soil. There is the trouble, is it holds them too well, packs down too tight, and drowns roots that can't push through it fast enough to breathe. The lime we're working in now does 2 things at once. It corrects the acid, which was poisoning anything you tried to grow here, regardless of how well you watered it, and it helps break the clay's structure open, just enough so water can move through, instead of simply sitting on top of everything and rotting the roots before they've had a fair chance. How long you been carrying all this around in your head? Since I was young enough to follow my father through a field without understanding half of what he was showing me. He'd crouch down the way I do, and he'd make me put my own hands in the dirt, and he'd ask me questions instead of giving me answers, because he said a fact you're handed slides right back out of a person's head, but a fact you work out for yourself tends to stay lodged there permanent. She sat back on her heels, something far away in her expression. I hated it some days as a girl. Wanted him to simply tell me the answer instead of making me stand in a field getting my hands cold working it out myself. I understand it better now than I did then. Amos turned that over, working the plow handle in his hands. "Suppose that's not so different from most things worth learning." "No," she agreed. "It generally isn't. The limestone went in first, worked by hand because they had no machine equal to the job. Amos did the heavy labor hauling, breaking, turning the ground with the crooked old plow his mule pulled at an angle on account of her bad hip. Odessa walked behind, telling him where to stop, where to turn, where to dig deeper. He did as she told him. He'd agreed to trust her, and he kept meaning it even on the mornings the work felt closer to madness than farming. She was not gentle in her instructions, and he came to respect that about her more than he expected to. She never said things like, "I think perhaps," or, "You might consider," she said. "Stop there. Left, deeper. Stop flat still." Apology folded into them anywhere. "Your father teach you to talk like that?" he asked, one gray morning, not unkindly. "Like what?" "Direct. Like there's no room in the sentence to be wrong." She was quiet a moment, breath fogging in the cold. He used to say vague instructions are just a person too frightened to be wrong out loud. If you're specific and you turn out wrong, at least you know exactly what needs fixing. Smart man. He was. He was also stubborn and wrong more often than he'd admit, and difficult to argue with over supper. A pause, a real man. Not a saint. Most decent people aren't. She glanced him from under the brim of an old hat he'd dug up for her. "Were you a saint, Amos Judd?" "Lord, no." The answer came out before he'd thought about whether he wanted to give it. "I drank for about 3 years running. Not the mean kind of drunk. The sad kind, which I've come to think might be the worse of the two." She kept looking at him, waiting, the way she waited when she wanted the rest of an answer and knew better than to rush him toward it. "What stopped you?" she asked. Running out of money helped some. He turned back to the plow. The work helped more. Man can't stay properly drunk once there's something that needs doing every single day. It don't allow for it. She nodded, and they went back to the ground, and neither of them said anything else for a good while, which suited them both fine. By the middle of the second month, something happened on that stretch of dirt that Amos had not seen in 3 years of trying. Things came up, small, ragged, pushing through the cold crust of the earth with a kind of stubborn insistence that looked less like plants and more like something refusing, flatly, to take no for an answer. Buckwheat seedlings thin as thread, rye shoots, pale green, trembling in the wind like they weren't yet sure they'd made the right decision. He saw them first on a gray Tuesday morning and stood over them a long while before he went and got her, wanting to look at them alone first, the way a man wants a private moment with something he's afraid might disappear if he speaks of it too soon. Then he went and found her. She was inside, bent over the small ledger she'd asked him to buy at Peterson's, making notes in that careful hand of hers. When she saw his face in the doorway, she was already reaching for her coat before he'd said a single word. They stood over the seedlings together. Amos said nothing. Odessa crouched down and studied them with the same care she'd given the frozen dirt that first morning. And then very quietly, "The lime worked faster than I expected. The ground's warmer than it has any right to be, at this elevation." "That mean?" "Yes," she said. "It means it's working." Amos looked down at those pale, stubborn little seedlings, and something happened in his chest he didn't have a ready word for. Not joy exactly. Not relief exactly. Something older than either of those. Something that had to do, in some way he couldn't fully trace, with the plain fact of things growing on ground he had personally given up on. Ground that was maybe not so different, when he thought about it honestly, from himself. He cleared his throat. "Going to see about fencing stock," he said. "We'll want to expand the plot come spring." "Yes," Odessa said. "We will." The word we sat there a moment in the cold morning air between them. Neither of them remarked on it. But Amos carried it back to the cabin like a coal he wasn't ready yet to set down. Word travels fast in a country where there isn't much else worth talking about. By the time the buckwheat stood ankle-high, word of Amos Judd's impossible field had leaked out of the mountains and down into Cinder Gulch the way water finds every crack it's offered. The first to come looking was a neighboring farmer named Otto Berg, a broad, quiet man with a heavy accent and a face that had clearly been a great many winters being disappointed by this same stretch of territory. He rode up on some thin excuse about a borrowed tool and stood at the edge of the field with his hat in both hands, staring at it like it had personally wronged him by existing. "That ground's been dead longer than you've owned it," Otto said. "Apparently it wasn't dead," Amos said. "Just misunderstood." Otto looked at Odessa, working near the far fence line, looked back at Amos. "What's she doing to it?" "Working," Amos said. "The kind that works. My own bottomland's been giving me the same trouble," Otto admitted after a moment, in the reluctant way a proud man admits to a stranger that he's been beaten by something. "3rd year running. My wife's been saying we ought to sell and try our luck further south." "Ask her," Amos said, tipping his chin toward Odessa. "Won't cost you anything but the asking. She'll want money for it. Women like that always do. Eventually. She hasn't asked me for a dime yet. Asked for limestone and seed, and I'd call that an investment more than a wage. Amos leaned against the fence post beside him. You've got nothing to lose by asking a question, Otto. Worst she tells you is she can't help. Best case, your third failed year turns into your first good one. Otto studied the rye a long moment, chewing on that the way a cautious man chews on anything that sounds too easy to be trusted. You always this free with advice to a stranger? Wasn't, 8 years running. Might be trying it out again. Amos shrugged. Cost me nothing either. That earned something close to a laugh out of the big Norwegian, low and surprised, like he hadn't expected to find himself laughing on a stranger's fence line over a stretch of rye. He looked at the field a while longer, didn't ask that day. But something in the set of his shoulders told Amos this was not the last he'd see of the man, and it wasn't. Otto Berg would be back inside the week, and back again after that, and something in Amos, some old rusted mechanism he'd assumed had failed entirely, began slowly to shift back into use. The particular shape of having a neighbor, a friend, even, though it would take a while yet before either man used that word out loud, both of them still cautious, in their own separate ways, about naming a good thing too early and somehow spoiling it by the naming. But that was a story for later. Otto's visits grew more frequent as that first season wore on, and with them came the ordinary rhythms of a friendship neither man had planned, but both had come, quietly, to depend on. Otto brought seed he'd heard was going cheap in town. Amos returned the favor with fencing wire he had no immediate use for. Neither man remarked on the trades as anything more than practical neighborliness, though both understood without needing to say so that the trades themselves were mostly an excuse for the conversation that came with them. Your wife, Otto said once, watching Odessa work the far fence line, correcting himself before Amos had a chance to. Pardon. Not your wife yet, Miss Marsh. Not yet, Amos agreed. She's a formidable one, that she is. Otto studied him a moment, the particular considering look of a man deciding whether a subject was his to raise. You look at her different than you look at most things, Amos. Different than you looked at anything, far as I've known you, which admittedly isn't so long a stretch of knowing. Long enough, apparently, to notice things that ain't your business to notice. Fair enough, Otto said, unbothered, and let the subject drop, though he wore, for the rest of that visit, the particular expression of a man who considered his observation entirely confirmed, regardless of the denial. What none of them noticed, not Amos, not Odessa, not even Otto Berg with his broad, watchful farmer's eyes, was the rider who came up the far ridge road 2 days after the first seedlings broke ground. He didn't come near the cabin, didn't come near the field. He sat his horse at a distance, at the tree line, where the land dipped enough to hide a man's shape against the timber, and he watched the woman working the soil with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hands buried in dark earth, and he watched the mountain man working the fence beside her, and he watched a long while, patient as weather. Then he turned his horse and rode back down toward Cinder Gulch, and further still, toward a mine office 2 valleys over, where a man named Warwick Sloan kept very careful track of every scrap of good ground and every rumor of good ore in 3 counties. Sloan had come into the territory 11 years earlier with nothing but a mining claim and a talent for arithmetic most men reserved for scripture. He'd built his fortune the slow, patient way, not through any single dramatic strike, but through the quiet accumulation of small advantages, one after another, until the advantages themselves became a kind of machine that ran without him needing to touch it directly. He owned pieces of the livery, pieces of the general store, an understanding with the territorial land clerk that nobody discussed openly, but everyone understood. He had never once, in 11 years, been seen to raise his voice. The writer found him at his desk, going over assay reports by lamplight, and delivered his account plainly, because Sloan did not care for embellishment and had made that clear to every man who worked for him. The writer had 2 things to report. The first was a field, thought dead for 3 years, now green with rye and buckwheat on ground everyone in the territory had long since written off. The second was a woman who knew soil the way most men only claimed to, a woman whose father, the writer had learned from a loose-lipped bartender in town, had spent 30 years studying not only what grew in ground but what lay beneath it. Warwick Sloan, when he heard both pieces of news together, did not smile. He simply set down his pen and folded his hands and asked the writer to tell him everything again, slower this time, from the beginning. Because Warwick Sloan had not built what he'd built in this territory by caring one particular thing about rye, or buckwheat, or the redemption of a lonely mountain man's dead field. He had built it by caring, very deeply, about what sat underneath the ground that grew it. He rose from his desk and crossed to the window, and looked out at the dark shapes of his own stamp mill silent for the night, and thought, the way he often thought, in the careful arithmetic that had carried him from nothing to everything in 11 patient years. A mountain man with no head for business, a woman with a dead scholar's knowledge locked up in her memory, and, if the rumor about the journals held any truth at all, likely a good deal more of that knowledge sitting recoverable somewhere on paper, waiting for the right buyer, and a stretch of high mountain ground nobody had ever bothered surveying properly, because nobody had ever imagined. There was reason to look twice at a field 3 separate men had already failed to farm. Sloane did not believe in curses. He did not believe dead ground stayed dead without a reason, and he did not believe living ground came back to life without one, either. He believed in samples and assay reports, and the particular kind of silver-bearing quartz that liked to run along old creek beds exactly like the one that fed Amos Judd Spring. "Keep watching," he told the writer. "Say nothing to anyone in town, and find out whatever you can about this Wicklow fellow who lost the wager. A man that desperate for coin is a man worth having on a short leash." The writer nodded and left him to his lamp and his ledgers, and Warwick Sloane sat back down, and turned to a fresh page, and began in his own small, exact hand to make notes of his own. Warwick Sloane did not come himself. Not at first, because that was never how Sloane operated. He'd built his mine and his money and his quiet grip on 3 counties of territorial paperwork by understanding one simple fact. The most dangerous thing a powerful man can do is look dangerous too early. So he sent Clara Fowler first. Clara Fowler ran her mouth the way other women ran a loom. Steady, patient, never quite lying, which was the part that made her so useful and so hard to fight. Her husband kept the hardware counter at the back of Peterson's, which put her, most mornings, within easy earshot of every wife in the valley who came in for nails or lamp wicks or a length of ribbon, and stayed to talk. She had a particular way of starting, always the same, always innocent enough on its own that no single sentence of it could ever be held against her later. "I do wonder where exactly that Marsh woman came from," she'd say, to whoever happened to be standing nearest the flour barrels, setting her basket down with the unhurried air of a woman who had nowhere else pressing to be, "and how she ended up out on Judd's land like that. If you think on it, it ain't what you'd call a normal arrangement. Heard the drifter had papers on her. Somebody would offer, because there was always somebody willing to offer. Some kind of claim. If that's true," Clara would say, letting the thought hang there, unfinished, the way a person leaves a door open on purpose. "Well, don't that mean she ain't rightly free to be out there at all?" It never went further than that. Not at first. Clara Fowler was too careful a woman to say anything a lawyer could later hold against her. She only asked questions. She only wondered aloud. But a question asked often enough, in a town small enough, starts to sound less like curiosity and more like an accusation. Nobody's willing to sign their name to. There was one voice, most mornings, that pushed back against it, though it rarely won the argument outright. Ingrid Halverson, who ran the boarding house at the north end of the street, and had buried 2 husbands and outlived a third, had no patience for gossip dressed up as concern. That woman rode into this valley with rope burns on her wrists. Ingrid said flatly, the 3rd or 4th time she heard Clara start in on it, "And you're standing here wondering about her arrangement. Seems to me the arrangement you ought to be wondering about is the one where a man sold her across a card table like a saddle. But go on. Wonder about whatever helps you sleep." Clara didn't have much of an answer for that. She simply smiled, the particular smile of a woman who intends to keep talking regardless, and moved on to the next customer, and the talk kept spreading anyway, the way water finds every crack it's offered whether anyone tries to stop it or not. Amos heard the talk 3 days before Odessa did. He sat on it, because he didn't know what to do about it yet, and 3 days turned out to be 2 days too long. He was in the barn mending a harness when she appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, chin up, and he could read the set of her jaw well enough by then to know she already knew. "You heard," he said. "Mrs. Berg told me. Otto's wife. Thought I ought to hear it kind before I heard it cruel." He set the harness down. "Clara Fowler's somebody's mouthpiece," he said. "She didn't invent this on her own." "I know." She stepped further into the barn, careful of her skirt out of some old habit that clung to her from a life before this one. And I know whose mouthpiece she is. People have been mentioning Warwick Sloane's name to me since I gave Otto's neighbor advice about his fields. Did you know Sloane already offered to buy that man's land? For almost nothing? Didn't know that particular. He's approached 4 other families this past year, all struggling. All suddenly a little less struggling because of what I've told them. Her hands went still at her sides. And now there are questions about who I am, where I came from, whether I'm even. She stopped herself, jaw tight. You are free. Anne said, I won you from a man who had no legal right to hold you in the first place. Can you prove that? He opened his mouth. Can you prove? She said. Careful now. Each word set down like a stone in a wall that Wicklow had no prior claim recorded somewhere, that there's no piece of paper, forged or otherwise, waiting to surface the moment it's useful to someone with money enough to make it look real? He didn't have an answer for that either. You know what money does to law out here, Amos. He did know. Knew it the way every man in the territory knew it, not in his head, but somewhere lower down, in his stomach, where the knowing sat heavy and did not go away. Odessa did not spend the following days waiting quietly for the trouble to resolve itself. She rode into town herself, 2 days later, on some ordinary errand, and found herself, entirely by chance, standing not 10 feet from Clara Fowler at the flour barrels in Peterson's, midway through the same familiar refrain to a new and unsuspecting listener. The store went quiet the moment Odessa was noticed. Mrs. Fowler, Odessa said evenly, into the sudden silence. I understand you've had a good many questions about my arrangement with Mr. Judd. I'd be happy to answer any of them directly, if you'd care to ask me instead of the flour barrels. Clara Fowler's mouth opened, and closed, and opened again, and produced, in the end, nothing at all. No questions today? Odessa said, not unkindly, gathering her own parcel from the counter. Then I expect I'll see you at the next dance, since I understand that's where most of the valley's business gets properly conducted these days. She nodded once, politely, to the room at large, and walked out, and it was, by most accounts that circulated afterward, the last time Clara Fowler was heard discussing the matter within earshot of anyone likely to repeat it back to Odessa Judd directly. He rode into town the following week, and paid a call on the only man in Cinder Gulch who could be reasonably called a lawyer, a thin, tired fellow named Corwin, who kept an office above the assay shop and spent most of his practice drawing up simple wills for men who died before finishing paying him. A woman has no standing on her own out here, Corwin told him, not unkind, turning a pen over in his fingers while he spoke, not the way a wife does. If somebody produces a document, even a bad one, even a forged one, and there's nobody with clear legal claim to stand against it, the magistrate's got nothing solid to weigh it against. It comes down to whoever's paper looks more official, half the time. That's simply the truth of how thin the law runs out here, Mr. Judd, and I'd be lying to you if I told you otherwise. And if she were married? Corwin set the pen down. Then you'd have standing to contest any claim made against her directly, as her husband under territorial statute. That's not nothing. That's the strongest thing available to you, given the circumstance. He studied Amos a moment. That an option you're considering? Might be, Amos said. I'll say one more thing, and then I'll leave it be, since it's none of my business how a man arranges his own household. Corwin set his pen down entirely and looked at Amos with something more direct than the careful lawyer's caution he'd been using the whole rest of the conversation. Whatever you decide, decide it because it's the right thing for the two of you, and not only because it's the sturdiest wall you can build against Sloane. Marriages built only as walls have a way of feeling like prisons to the person living inside them, once the danger that justified the wall has passed. I've drawn up enough divorce settlements in this territory to know the difference in a man's face when I ask him why he married in the first place. Amos turned that over on the ride home, longer than he expected to, the mule picking her way through drifts, while he sat with the lawyer's unsolicited wisdom lodged somewhere behind his ribs alongside everything else he was carrying that week. He left without saying more that day, because he hadn't yet said it to the one person who actually needed to hear it. Sloane himself arrived on a Tuesday, overcast sky, the color of old pewter sitting low over the peaks. Amos was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard horses on the road. He came around the corner and found Warwick Sloane already dismounting, easy as a man who'd spent his whole life on horseback and never once thought twice about it, broad through the shoulders. Good wool coat. a face weathered into something hard and not entirely unhandsome and entirely unbothered by the cold. Behind him, a thin younger man carried a leather sajud. Sloan, fine morning, it's overcast. Something almost like a smile crossed Sloane's face and did not travel far. Mind if we step in business? Won't take long. Amos did not invite him inside. He stood at the fence and waited. Sloane came forward anyway, rested one gloved hand on the top rail and turned to study the field. The buckwheat had come and gone by then, turned back into the soil the way Odessa had planned it, and what stood now was a cover of winter rye running green across ground that had been nothing but brown dirt and disappointment for 3 years. Remarkable work, Sloane said. It is. I understand she's been helping the valley, too. She's been talking to people who ask her questions, generous of her. Sloane's eyes moved slowly along the fence line, cataloging something Amos couldn't see the shape of yet. I run interests across 11 farms in this territory, Judd. I've watched most of them struggle the same way you struggled before she came along. Poor drainage. Bad seed. Men doing what their fathers did on ground that never asked to be farmed that way. 11 years I've watched this territory chew up families who arrived with nothing but hope in a wagon. Sloane went on, unhurried, as though Amos hadn't spoken at all. Most of them fail. Not for lack of trying, for lack of understanding what they were actually working with. I've bought up more failed claims and abandoned homesteads than I care to count, Judd, and I want you to understand something plainly before we go any further. I don't consider that predatory. I consider it simple economics. Land finds its way, eventually, to whoever's prepared to use it properly. That's how you tell yourself the story. It's the only honest version of the story there is. Something flickered behind Sloane's eyes, brief and cold, gone again before it could be properly named. Get to the business part, Sloane. Sloane turned from the field and looked at Amos directly, and something in his face recalibrated, small, precise, the look of a man adjusting a plan mid-sentence. I'd like to offer her a position, he said, at the mine office. Her own quarters. A fair wage, better than fair. What she's giving away for free, she could be properly compensated for. She could help every family I've got an interest in, and a good many I don't, if the arrangement suited her. You could ride up here and ask her yourself. I'm asking you. It's a courtesy, Judd. Extended husband to husband. Since I understand that's the proper channel for such things out here. I heard that part, Amos said. And I'm telling you she's not mine to speak for. Never has been, whatever the paper in your satchel might claim about it. A fair wage, I said. Perhaps I wasn't clear enough about the figure. I'm prepared to offer considerably more than what a mountain homestead could reasonably provide her, and a good deal more security besides. Women out here don't often get offered the chance to be valued for their minds rather than their labor. I'd have thought you'd want that for her, if you care for her the way I suspect you've come to. What I want for her, Amos said, is to be asked plain, by somebody who intends to take her answer for a final one. Not offered a wage by a man who's already decided the answer doesn't much matter so long as the price gets high enough. Sloane's jaw shifted, barely. He reached back without looking, and the younger man opened the satchel and produced a folded set of papers and offered them across the fence. These were filed in Cheyenne, Sloane said, some 16 months back. They described the sale of a woman matching the description of the one currently residing on your property. The man named in these documents held prior claim before you ever sat down at that card table, which means under territorial property law as it presently stands. She was not property to begin with, Amos said. Not his to sell. Not anybody's, be that as it may. Those papers are forged. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation, Amos said. Sloane lowered the papers slow, studied Amos a moment longer than was comfortable. A hearing's been requested, he said finally, by interested parties. 2 weeks, here in Cinder Gulch. The magistrate will review the documentation and settle the legal question of Mrs. Marsh's status. He tucked the papers away. I'd suggest you find yourself someone who understands the law, for your own sake. Already have, Amos said, which was not entirely true yet, but felt worth saying regardless. Sloane looked once more at the green rye, and whatever he was thinking he kept carefully off his face, and then he mounted up and rode back down the mountain without another word. Amos stood at the fence a long while after the horses had gone, working the word property around in his mouth like something bitter he couldn't quite spit out. He found her at the kitchen table when he went inside. She'd heard. He could tell by how still she was sitting. How much did you catch? Enough. He sat across from her, put both hands flat on the table, the way a man does when he's about to say something he's been circling for a while, and has finally run out of road to keep circling on. I think we should get married, he said. The silence that followed was the loudest silence he'd sat inside in 8 years. Odessa looked at him steady, didn't flinch, didn't laugh, didn't say no straight off, which he took, cautiously, as something. You're saying that because of the hearing. I'm saying it's the best legal protection available to you right now. A wife has standing in this territory that whatever you currently are on paper does not. I asked Corwin about it last week. He confirmed as much. He paused. And I'm saying it because I should have thought of your situation properly before it turned into a threat. I was thinking about Rye, about the field. I wasn't thinking hard enough about how exposed that left you. That's mine to own. She was quiet a long moment. The stove popped once. Twice. I don't want a marriage that's a legal strategy, she said finally. I know. And I don't want you marrying me out of guilt. I know that too. Then what is it? He met her eyes. Because looking away from felt like the worst cowardice. I don't want you to leave, he said. That's the whole of it. I was going to keep not saying that until the problem solved itself somehow, which is what I do with everything that scares me. But there isn't time left for that now. The silence this time was smaller, softer around the edges. I'm 29 years old, she said at last. I have seen enough of the world to know most of what people call love is just desperation wearing a nicer coat. I am not interested in that particular version of it. Understood. But you are the first person in a long while who has spoken to me like what I think actually matters. And I would be lying if I said that hadn't. She stopped herself. I'm not saying no, she said. I'm saying I need a day. Take 2, Amos said. She took 1. She spent part of that one night, sitting up with Greta Berg, who had ridden over unannounced the moment word of the proposal reached her, some instinct telling her Odessa might want company. That wasn't Amos for the working through of it. You don't have to say yes, Greta told her plainly, settling into the one chair while Odessa sat on the edge of the bed. Whatever anybody in this valley might think about the practicality of it, a woman's still allowed to say no to a marriage, even a sensible one, even one that solves a genuine problem. I know that. Do you want to say yes? Odessa was quiet a long moment, turning the question over the same careful way she turned over a fistful of unfamiliar soil. I've spent most of my adult life either being told what I was worth by men who never once asked me, or proving what I was worth to men who eventually asked, and then didn't much like the honest answer they got back. I don't know if I trust my own wanting anymore, Greta. I've had to bury it too many times to be certain it's still there in any shape I recognize. And Amos? Amos asks me things and then waits to hear what I actually say back, instead of what he expects to hear. She looked down at her own hands, the rope scars faded now to thin, pale lines she'd nearly stopped noticing. I don't know what to call that yet. I only know I haven't encountered much of it in my life, and I'm not eager to walk away from it over some private worry about whether I trust my own wanting. Greta reached over and took her hand, the same unhurried way Odessa had come to recognize as simply how the Berg family loved people, without much fanfare, without needing the gesture explained. Then I expect you already know your answer, Greta said. Sounds to me like you're just waiting on your own nerve to catch up to it. She came to him the next morning in the field, before either of them had eaten, hands buried deep in the pockets of a coat that was still, months later, too big for her. Yes, she said. Just the one word. Just like that. I gave it the night. I don't need more nights than that to know a plain fact when I've turned it over enough times to be sure of it. She looked at him a long moment, something guarded, still sitting behind her eyes, even as the rest of her seemed to have made peace with the decision. But I need you to understand what I'm agreeing to, Amos. I am agreeing to a marriage, not to a rescue. I have never once, in the whole of my life, needed rescuing. And I am not about to start needing it now, simply because the paperwork requires a husband's name on it. I understand the distinction. Good. Then let's go find a justice of the peace before Sloan has time to complicate matters any further than he already has. The ceremony took 8 minutes in an office above the telegraph station. A justice of the peace named Pratt, no relation to Cyrus Pratt at the livery, a fact that caused some confusion among the handful of witnesses until it was sorted out, who mentioned twice in that short span that this was only the 7th marriage he'd performed in the territory. Otto Berg stood witness, quiet and serious, as a man standing witness to something he understood was bigger than a formality. His wife, a soft-spoken woman named Greta, cried, which surprised everyone in the room, including Greta. Amos said the words when it was his turn to say them. Odessa said them clear, without hesitation. And when Pratt finished and said, "You are now married, under the laws of this territory," Odessa held her hand out to Amos, and he shook it, like they'd closed a fair business deal, which, in the strictest legal sense, they had. Otto made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Sorry," Amos said. "Don't be," Odessa said, and almost smiled. They rode home from the ceremony mostly silent, the particular silence of two people who had just changed the shape of their lives, with 8 minutes and a handshake, and weren't yet sure what to do with the new shape of it. "I'll move my things to the loft," Amos said, once they were back and the fire was going. "Seems proper now. Man and wife under one roof. Separate beds don't look right to anybody who comes calling." "Nobody's coming calling tonight," Odessa said. "No, but they will, eventually. Figured I'd get ahead of it." She was quiet a moment, watching him gather the blanket he'd slept under on the floor for months now. "You've been sleeping on that pallet since the night you brought me here. Man makes do. You don't have to keep making do, Amos. Not on my account. This is your cabin. It was your cabin before I ever set foot in it, and a legal ceremony this afternoon doesn't change who's been giving up the bed all this time." "Wasn't giving anything up," he said. "Choosing where I slept. Different thing." She studied him a long moment, something working behind her eyes that he couldn't quite read yet, though he was starting, slowly, to get better at reading most of the rest of her. "The loft, then," she said finally. "For now. Until neither of us minds the arrangement being any different than that." It was as close to an admission as either of them was prepared to make that first night, and it sat between them warm and unfinished and entirely enough, for the time being, to be going on with. Otto Berg became, over the following months, the first real friend Amos had allowed himself in 8 years, and neither man remarked on that fact out loud because remarking on it felt like it might scare it off. Otto had come to the territory 9 years earlier from a farming valley in the old country, following a brother who'd since moved on to prospecting further west and never sent word again. He'd built his own homestead from nothing, the same as Amos had, and had lost 2 crops running to the same acid ground and poor drainage that had plagued half the valley, before Odessa's advice turned his 3rd season around. He didn't talk about the brother much. Amos didn't push. Men who'd both lost things tended to recognize, without needing to say so, exactly how much room to leave around a subject. Amos built the table that same autumn, though at the time neither of them called it anything more than a practical fix for a kitchen that had grown too crowded with seed packets and correspondence for the one small surface he'd made do with for 15 years alone. He cut the timber himself, off his own property, and shaped it over 2 weeks of evenings in the barn, working by lamplight after the day's field work was finished, because his hands needed something to do that wasn't simply waiting on his shoulder to stop aching from the day's labor. "What's all this in aid of?" Odessa asked, the evening he finally carried it in and set it against the kitchen wall, sturdy and square on its legs and entirely without ornament. "Old table wasn't big enough for your notebooks and your seed lists and whatever else you keep piling onto it. You built me a bigger table because my paperwork made you feel crowded. Built you a bigger table because you deserved a proper place to do the work you're doing," he said, which was closer to the truth of it, and he watched her run her hand across the surface, the same slow, careful way she ran her hand across soil. She was reading for the first time. "It's good," she said. "Not fine work, just honest work." "Same thing out here," she said, and that was the whole of the conversation. Though the table stood between them after that, as a kind of quiet marker, neither one of them ever bothered explaining to Otto or anybody else who asked why a mountain cabin needed a table nearly wide enough to seat 6. Ingrid Halverson asked about it once, on one of her rare visits up the mountain, to check on how the newly married pair were faring, running her hand along the timber the same appraising way she ran her hand along anything she was deciding whether to trust. "Man doesn't build a table this size for 2 people, she observed. "Man builds it for the work," Amos said, "not the number of chairs." Ingrid didn't look convinced, though she didn't press the matter further, simply filing the observation away with the particular satisfaction of a woman who suspected she understood more about the household than either of its occupants had yet admitted to themselves. Otto brought firewood he hadn't been asked to bring. His grown son Peter helped with fencing. Amos couldn't manage alone with his shoulders still stiff from years of overwork and worse sleep. Greta sent bread, wrapped warm in cloth, more often than any reasonable accounting of neighborliness required. And Amos, who had spent nearly a decade convinced he preferred the company of no one, found himself standing at his own fence line some evenings, talking to Otto about nothing important, and discovering that nothing important could still feel like something. "You ever think about going back?" Amos asked him once, watching the sun drop behind the western ridge. "To the old country. Every winter," Otto said. "Every single winter when the cold gets into my hands the way it does now. And then spring comes, and I remember there was nothing there for me to go back to that wasn't already gone before I ever left it." He glanced sideways. "You understand that better than most men I know." "Reckon I do. But I'll tell you this," Otto went on after a while, in the particular considering tone of a man weighing a truth he didn't often say aloud. "I've got Greta, and I've got Peter, and I've got a piece of ground that's finally starting to feed us properly, instead of nearly starving us. Man could do worse with the life he ended up living, instead of the one he'd originally planned." "Could," Amos agreed. "You planned different, too, once." "I'd guess. Planned real different," Amos said, and didn't elaborate further. And Otto, understanding by then exactly how much room that particular subject required, didn't push him toward it either. They'd say much more than that. Didn't need to. The two of them simply stood at the fence a while longer, watching the last light drain from the ridgeline. Two men who'd each buried a version of the life they'd once imagined for themselves and had found, against most reasonable odds, something worth building in its place. "You have mended that harness 3 times, Odessa told him one night, not looking up from her ledger. "It does not require mending a 4th. There's a weak seam near the—" "There is not a seam. I checked." He set the harness down, looked at his hands. "I don't like being useless. You're not useless. I'm not useful either. Those aren't the same thing." She turned a page. "Otto's been by twice this week. His son's been covering half your firewood without being asked." "I didn't ask him to." "I know you didn't." She glanced up finally. "People change when they've got reason to, Amos. You gave the valley a reason." "We did," he said. She didn't argue that one. Word of the wedding, and of the field, had by then carried far enough down the valley that families Amos had never once spoken to began finding reasons to ride up and ask Odessa questions. She turned none of them away. She rode out most Sundays that autumn, Amos beside her more often than not, and spent whole afternoons walking somebody else's failing ground the way she'd once walked his. The Ashford place sat lower in the valley, richer soil by most accounts, and yet the family had struggled 3 seasons running to make sense of why nothing they planted ever quite thrived the way their neighbors' crops did. Odessa knelt in their south field the better part of an hour, working the dirt between her fingers, the same patient way she'd worked Amos's ground the first morning he'd ever watched her do it. "Your soil isn't acidic," she told them finally, standing brushing her hands clean. "It's compacted. There's a difference, and it matters which one you're dealing with, because the fix for one will do nothing at all for the other, and might even make it worse. You need gypsum, not lime. Gypsum breaks the clay particles apart without changing what's already a fair balance underneath. Your roots simply can't reach past the first few inches right now. That's the whole of your trouble." "Where do we find gypsum out here, young?" Mr. Ashford asked, hat in his hands, the particular posture of a man who had stopped expecting good news some seasons back and wasn't yet sure he trusted it now that it had arrived. "Supply house in Helena carries it. You won't need as much as you'd think. 80 pounds ought to cover the acreage you've described to me. How long before we see anything?" "1 season, most likely. Sooner, if your spring runs wet." She looked at him steady. "Your land doesn't hate you, Mr. Ashford. It's simply been asking for something nobody ever thought to give it." His wife, standing at the edge of the field with an expression Amos recognized from his own kitchen, not so many months back, pressed a hand briefly to her mouth and said nothing at all, because there was nothing that needed saying that her face hadn't already said plainly enough. Amos watched Odessa work through half a dozen such afternoons that autumn, watched her answer question after question with the same flat, exact patience she'd once used on his own ruined field, and understood, more clearly each time, that what he'd won at a card table in January had turned out to be worth more to this entire stretch of territory than he had any right to imagine that cold night in the Broken Spur. Not every visit went as easily as the Ashford place had. An old-timer named Silas Corbett, who'd farmed the same stony patch on the valley's eastern rim for the better part of 30 years, met Odessa's arrival with open suspicion, arms crossed, refusing at first to let her past his own fence line. "Don't need advice from a woman half my age telling me my own dirt," Corbett said, however many books her father wrote. "I haven't offered you advice yet, Mr. Corbett," Odessa said, unbothered. "I've offered to look. There's a considerable difference, and you're welcome to send me home the moment you decide you've heard enough of what I actually have to say, rather than deciding it beforehand on account of what I look like standing at your gate." He let her look in the end, mostly out of what Amos suspected was simple curiosity he was too proud to admit to. She knelt in his field the same unhurried way she knelt in every field, and diagnosed a drainage problem running back, by her estimate, at least 2 decades, buried under a habit of planting the same failing crop in the same failing spot, because that was where his own father had always planted it. Corbett didn't thank her outright, didn't smile, didn't soften, didn't offer the kind of gratitude the Ashfords had. But he took her advice, quietly, over that following season, and by the next autumn, his own stubborn field was producing better than it had in a decade. And though he never once said so directly to Odessa's face, he took to tipping his hat to her whenever their paths crossed in town afterward, which counted, in a man like Corbett, for a considerable admission. It was in the middle of that same stretch of good weeks that the letter from Larkspur Crossing finally arrived. Amos had written to the bookseller there back in the spring, on the strength of nothing more than a name Odessa had overheard once, shouted in an argument about price. He hadn't told her he'd written until the reply came, because he hadn't wanted to hand her a hope that might come to nothing. The letter was short and businesslike, and it took Odessa 2 full readings before she trusted what it said. The bookseller, a Mr. Aldous Renner, by his signature, had indeed purchased a leather case of agricultural notebooks from a man matching Wicklow's description some 14 months prior. He'd been unable to find a buyer for what he described as books of no obvious commercial value beyond their binding, and had kept them, unsold, in a dry cabinet at the back of his shop ever since. He was willing to return them, upon confirmation of rightful ownership, for the cost of postage alone. Odessa read the letter a 3rd time, at the kitchen table, and then simply sat there with it, not moving, for long enough that Amos came and stood behind her chair without saying anything, because he understood by then that some moments didn't want words put anywhere near them. "He kept them," she said, finally quiet. 14 months, and he kept them. Seems he did. I'd made my peace with them being gone. I want you to know that. I'd told myself it was one more thing the world had taken that I wasn't getting back, and I'd folded that into all the rest of it, and I thought I was done grieving it. She pressed her palm flat against the letter, the same gesture she used on soil she was reading for the first time. "I wasn't done. I don't think I knew how undone I still was until just now." "Write him back," Amos said. "Tell him where to send them." The notebooks arrived 6 weeks later, carried up the mountain by a postal rider who had no notion at all of what he was delivering. Odessa opened the leather case at the kitchen table and sat a long while with her hands resting on the covers before she opened a single one, and Amos found something else to occupy himself with in another part of the cabin, because he understood that this, too, was not a moment that wanted an audience. When he came back in, she had 2 of the notebooks open in front of her, pen already moving, and she did not look up, and her face wore the particular expression of someone reading a letter from a person they had missed for a very long time and had never expected to hear from again. He made coffee. He set a cup by her elbow. He said nothing, and that turned out to be exactly the right thing to say. It was Otto who first mentioned, offhand, the old logging road that cut down through Sloane's mine property toward the river, the one that used to be the shortest route into town, before Sloane fenced it off 8 years back and forced everyone onto the longer road around. 8 years, Amos repeated, something cold moving through him before he understood why. About that same winter they opened the second shaft, fenced the old road right about the time the fever came through the valley. Otto shrugged, not thinking much of it. Coincidence, probably. Amos did not think it was a coincidence, not once the thought had lodged itself in him. He rode down to the old fence line the next morning, alone, and stood a long while looking at rusted wire strung across a road that used to run alongside the creek his own cabin spring fed into, upstream, before it ever reached his land. He rode into town that same afternoon and asked old Doc Whitfield, retired now, but he'd been the only doctor in the territory that terrible winter 8 years back, what he remembered of the fever. Whitfield's face did something complicated. Came on sudden, he said. Worse in the households closest to the creek. I always wondered. He stopped himself. Wondered what? Sloane's second shaft was running tailings into that same water that winter. I saw it myself once, before they fenced the road off entirely, a gray runoff, 9, coming down where the creek narrowed. I never could prove it was the cause of the sickness. Fevers travel plenty of ways a man can't always trace, and I want you to hear that part plainly before you go running off with half a notion in your head. I'm not telling you I know it caused what took your family, Amos. I'm telling you I never stopped wondering, and I never had the standing or the money to make anybody else wonder alongside me. He looked at Amos with something between pity and apology. Your Rebecca's place was right along that stretch, wasn't it? Amos didn't answer. He didn't need to. He rode over to the land office before heading home and spent an hour going through what old survey records the clerk would let him see, tracing the creek's path on a yellowed territorial map, matching it against what he remembered of that winter, which households had sickened first, which hadn't sickened at all, and how neatly, when he laid it all out, the pattern followed the water rather than the weather. It wasn't proof. He knew that even as he traced the lines with his finger, a pattern wasn't the same thing as a cause, and he was honest enough with himself, even in the grip of something that felt very much like rage finally finding a direction to point in, to know the difference. But it was somewhere to start looking, and after 8 years of having nowhere at all to point his grief, somewhere to start looking felt like the first solid ground he'd stood on in longer than he could easily remember. He rode home slower than he'd ridden anywhere in a long time, because something in his chest had gone quiet in a way that frightened him more than anger ever had. Because for 8 years he had buried his wife and his son under a word fever. Like fever was weather. Like fever was simply something that happened to a person, the way winter happened, blameless and unstoppable. And now there was a name attached to it. Not a certainty. Not yet. But a name, and a direction, and a man he could ride toward, instead of a season he could only endure. Which meant, for the first time in 8 years, his grief had somewhere specific to go. He rode up to the ridge before he rode home. Stood a long while at the 2 markers he'd cut himself, 8 winters back, with hands that had shaken so badly the letters had come out crooked and small. He hadn't visited much these past months. Hadn't needed to, in the particular way a man needs a grave when grief is the only company he's got left. The field had been keeping him busy. Odessa's had been keeping him busier still. He felt, standing there now, something close to guilty about that, until he made himself set the guilt down too, because Rebecca had never once, in all the years he'd known her living, wanted him lonely on her account. Might have found who did it, he said out loud, to the 2 markers, to the wind, to nobody who could answer him back. Not certain yet. Whitfield won't swear to it, and I understand why he won't. But I mean to find out proper whatever it costs me to find out. The wind didn't answer either. It never had. But he stood there a good while longer anyway, had in his hands, the cold working into his knees, and when he finally turned the mule back down toward the cabin, he felt something in his chest that wasn't lighter exactly, but was, for the first time in a long while, pointed somewhere other than simply down. He didn't tell Odessa right away. He told himself it was because he wasn't certain yet, and that was partly true. But mostly it was because he was afraid of what he'd do with it once he let it fully in, and he did not yet trust himself around that particular fire. She found out anyway. She always did, eventually, being the kind of woman who noticed when a man's silence had changed shape. "You've gone somewhere else," she said one evening, watching him stare at the stove without seeing it. He told her, all of it. Whitfield's careful hedging. The creek. The fenced road opened the same winter the second shaft went in. The survey map at the land office and the pattern he'd traced across it with one finger, over and over, like tracing it enough times might turn suspicion into certainty through sheer repetition alone. She was quiet a long while. "That's not proof," she said finally, gently. "The way a person handles something they know is fragile even while they're being honest about it. I know. But it's motive. If it's true, if you can ever prove it's true, it changes what this is. It stops being about land or rye, or even about me. It becomes something else entirely." "I know that too," Amos said. And something in his voice, low and level, and entirely unlike the man who'd sat quiet by his own dead fire for 8 winters, told her he meant it in a way that worried her more than it comforted her. There was a stretch of days that autumn, before any of the trouble broke fully into the open, that Amos would think back on afterward as the last easy days of that whole difficult year. A harvest dance was held at the Halvorsen boarding house, the kind of small gathering the valley threw together whenever the crops came in decent enough to justify the fiddle player's fee, and Otto insisted, over Amos's protest, that the two of them attend. Odessa did not want to go. Said so plainly, "I don't dance," she said, "and I have spent enough of my life being looked at by rooms full of strangers to last me a lifetime. I haven't finished living yet." "Nobody's asking you to dance," Amos said. "I can't dance either, not since I was young enough not to know better. We'll stand in the corner and drink bad coffee, and let the room look at us as long as it wants to. Costs us nothing," she went. She stood in the corner with him, arms crossed, watching Otto's grown son attempt, with great enthusiasm and no discernible skill, to court a young woman from a neighboring farm. The fiddle player, an itinerant fellow who passed through the valley perhaps twice a year and stretched each visit as long as the hospitality allowed, worked through a set of reels that had half the room, stamping their boots against floorboards that hadn't seen this much cheerful abuse in longer than anyone could readily recall. Otto found them in their corner partway through the evening, flushed from dancing with Greta, and clapped Amos on his good shoulder, with rather more enthusiasm than the shoulder strictly welcomed. "Never thought I'd see the day," Otto said, grinning. Amos Judd, standing at a dance, looking almost like a man enjoying himself. "Not dancing," Amos pointed out. "Give it time. A man standing this close to happiness generally finds his feet moving eventually, whether he intends it or not." Otto glanced at Odessa, something warm and genuine in it. "Your wife's done more for this valley in half a year than the Territorial Land Office has managed in a decade of empty promises. Half these families wouldn't have a crop worth dancing over if she hadn't ridden out to their fields and told them plainly what they were doing wrong. She'd tell you not to make too much of it." "She would," Odessa confirmed. "I'm standing right here, and I am telling you not to make too much of it." Otto laughed, unbothered, and wandered back toward the refreshment table, and Amos watched him go with something that had grown, over these past months, into a genuine and uncomplicated fondness he hadn't expected to feel for another human being ever again in his life. And when Ingrid Halvorsen came by with a plate of something sweet, and told Odessa, plainly, that half the valley owed their planting seasons to her advice, and the other half would soon enough once word finished spreading, Odessa had gone quiet in a way that wasn't guarded at all. "They mean it," she said to Amos later, on the ride home, something unguarded in her voice he hadn't heard before. "I keep waiting for the kindness to turn out to be conditional. It hasn't yet." "Might not ever," Amos said. "Might not," she agreed, and let that sit between them the rest of the ride, warm as anything either of them had said aloud all year. The betrayal, when it came from the last direction either of them expected. It was late in the season, past dark, when Otto Berg showed up at the cabin door alone, without his wife, without his son, hat in both hands and his face gone the particular gray of a man who has decided, finally, that a debt owed to his own conscience has outgrown whatever debt he owes anybody else. "I need to tell you something," Otto said, "and you're not going to want to hear it." Amos let him in. "Sloane's had me reporting to him," Otto said. No preamble, because he'd clearly decided the only way through this was straight through it, since before you ever won her at that table. "I owed him money, old money, from the year my second crop failed, before Odessa ever set foot in this valley. Peter was sick that winter, sicker than I ever told anyone in this valley, because a proud man doesn't advertise how close he came to losing his own son over a debt he couldn't pay the doctor. Sloane covered the doctor's bill, without my asking. I didn't understand then that a man like that never covers anything without expecting it back, with interest he hasn't bothered to name yet." He sat heavily in the chair by the door, not waiting to be offered it, the posture of a man too tired to stand through his own confession. He came to collect that spring, once Peter was well, and the debt to the doctor had quietly become a debt to him instead. He offered another way to settle it. "Watch you. Watch the field. Tell him what grew, what didn't, what she said, what she knew." The room went very still. "How long?" Amos said. "Since the beginning. Since before the wedding. You were in my barn 2 days ago, helping fix my fence. I know it. You ate at my table, Otto. Your wife baked bread for a woman you were selling out for coin. I know it. Otto's voice cracked on the second time saying it. I've hated myself every single visit. I told myself it was small things, harmless things. Told myself you'd never even know, and no harm would come of it. And I could keep on owing him without it costing you anything real. He looked up, and his eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it. I was wrong. He's not after your land for the rye, Amos. He's after what's under it. Something cold settled into Amos's chest. Under it. Her father's notes. Whatever's in that woman's head about the ground. Sloane's men found silver traces 2 ridges over last spring. If there's more running under your section. Otto's jaw worked. He doesn't want you married and settled. He wants you gone. And her working for him, instead of you, where he can control what she knows and who she tells it to. The silence stretched long enough that the fire had time to pop twice before either man spoke again. Get out, Amos said. Quiet, which was worse somehow than shouting would have been. Otto stood, turned for the door, stopped with his hand on the latch. I'm going to fix this, he said, not looking back. However I can. I don't expect you to believe that tonight. I wouldn't, in your place. He left. Amos stood a long while in the doorway, watching the shape of him disappear down the dark road, and felt something in himself that had only just begun, cautiously, to trust the world again, close back up like a fist. Odessa found him still standing there a half-hour later. You heard, he said, without turning. Enough of it. He's been feeding Sloane information since before we married. I know. She came to stand beside him at the door, and after a moment, without asking, she took his hand. And I also know you're standing here deciding whether trusting anyone was ever a mistake to begin with. He didn't answer, which was, in its own way, an answer. Don't, she said. One man's weakness doesn't undo what's true. Otto Berg brought us firewood he didn't have to bring. His wife baked bread, out of genuine kindness, even while her husband carried a debt he was ashamed of. Those things were real too. People aren't only the worst thing they've done, Amos. If they were, neither of us would be standing in this doorway. Right now, you'd still be a man who let his own fire die twice a week, and I'd still be sitting on a saloon floor waiting for nothing in particular. He looked down at her, and something in his chest, cold since Otto's confession, eased a fraction, not all the way, but enough to keep breathing around. I still don't know if I can trust him again, Amos said. I'm not asking you to, not tonight. I'm only asking you not to decide the whole of the answer before you've had time to see what he does next. Otto came back 3 nights later, not for supper, not with an apology dressed up in bread or borrowed tools. He came riding hard through the dark with no hat and blood on one sleeve, and he pounded on the cabin door until Amos had it open before the man could finish the second knock. Sloane's done waiting on the hearing, Otto said, breathless, doubled over with his hands on his knees. He's not filing more papers. He's not sending lawyers. He's sending men. Tonight, to take the field, take her, and make whatever's left of this look like an accident nobody has to answer for. Amos went cold and still. The particular stillness that had once, a lifetime ago, kept him alive through winters that killed better-prepared men. How do you know? Overheard it. Went to see him tonight, meaning to tell him plain that I was done reporting, done owing him anything at all, whatever it cost me to say it. Found 2 of his men saddling up in the yard before I ever got as far as his office door. Heard enough through an open window to understand exactly what they were saddling up for. Otto's breath came ragged, half from the ride and half from something closer to shame. Should have come straight to warn you. Instead, I stood there a good minute deciding whether I even had the right to, after everything. That's on me too, whatever time it cost us tonight. How many? 6. Maybe more. Coming up from the South Ridge. I only just got clear of them myself, and only because I've spent 9 years learning every deer trail on this mount better than they've learned the main road. Otto straightened, wincing, pressing a hand to his bleeding arm, where a branch or a bullet had caught him on the way up. It was too dark yet to tell which. I'm not asking you to trust me again tonight, Amos. I know I've got no right to that yet, but I'm asking you to let me stand with you anyway, because I owe this mountain more than money, and I intend to start paying it back tonight, whether you forgive me for it or not. Behind them, in the doorway, Odessa had gone very still, one hand pressed flat against the frame. Because the hearing that was supposed to settle this quietly, in a room full of witnesses and paperwork and careful legal language, was no longer coming. What was coming instead was riding up the mountain in the dark, right now, with no interest whatsoever in the law. Amos didn't waste time being afraid. Fear was a thing for later, if there was a later. He moved. "Lamp out," he said, and Odessa had it out before he'd finished the second word, plunging the cabin into a darkness thick enough to swim through. Otto. Barn door. Get the mule loose so she's got somewhere to run that isn't standing still in a stall. On it. Don't, she said, already at the shelf where he kept the old rifle, the one he'd bought used off a trapper years back, and never once needed to fire at a man. Don't you dare tell me to hide in a root cellar, Amos Judd. I have buried a father, survived a kidnapping, and rebuilt 3 years of dead ground with my own 2 hands. I am not spending tonight cowering under my own floorboards. He almost laughed. Almost. Because even now, even with 6 armed men climbing his mountain in the dark, some stubborn part of him found room to be proud of her. Then you're at the window, he said instead. West side. You see anything move that isn't Otto or me, you fire a warning first and a real shot second. You understand? I understand. Say it back. Warning first. Real shot second. Her hands were steady on the rifle. Steadier than his own if he was honest about it. Now go do whatever it is you're about to do, and don't you dare get yourself killed being noble about it. I did not marry a corpse. Wasn't planning on it. See that you keep to the plan. Otto was already at the barn door, working the latch with hands that fumbled once before steadying. Mule's loose, he called back. She'll run for the tree line same as any sensible creature would. Get behind the woodpile after. Good cover. And it's got a clean line on the east side of the barn. You've thought about this before tonight. Thought about a great many things. These past 8 years, lying awake with nothing better to do. Amos checked the rifle one last time. Never thought I'd need any of it. Man plans for weather up here. Doesn't much plan for 6 riders coming up his own road in the dark. Well, Otto said, grim, already moving for his position. Tonight you get to use it anyway. Because that was the thing about mountains. They belonged, in the end, to whoever knew them best. Not to whoever had the most men, or the most money, or the most confidence riding up a dark road they'd never walked in daylight. Amos had walked every inch of this mountain for 15 years. He knew where the ground dropped sudden under snow that looked flat. He knew which trees held rot at the base and would go down with one good shove. He knew the exact bend in the creek where a horse would spook, if the water ran fast enough under thin ice. He knew, too, in a way that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with 8 long winters of walking this ground alone, because there was nothing else left to do with himself. Exactly how sound carried in this particular hollow, and exactly where a man could stand and hear 6 horses coming a full quarter hour before their riders ever suspected they'd been heard at all. Sloane's men did not know any of that, which was going to matter. A great deal before this night was through. Amos moved into the tree line above the cabin, low breath fogging white and quick despite every effort to slow it down. Below him, torches bobbed up the road, 6 of them, maybe 7, hard to count through the black timber. Voices carried thin on the cold air. Men who thought they were riding toward an easy thing. A woman, a wounded field, a mountain man, who'd spent 8 years forgetting how to fight for anything. They were about to learn different. Amos found the rotted birch first, leaned his full weight into it, until it gave with a groan loud enough to send 2 horses screaming sideways, riders cursing, torches scattering into the snow and going out. One man went down hard. Didn't get back up right away. Good, Amos thought. That's one. He was already moving again before the thought finished, circling wide through the dark toward the second position he'd marked in his head on the walk up, because a man who'd spent 15 years alone on this mountain had spent a great deal of that time simply walking it, learning it, without ever once imagining he'd need to know it this well. Funny the things grief teaches a man, if he lets it. He found the second position at the narrow shelf of trail, where the ground fell away sharp to the creek bed below, a spot he'd nearly broken his own leg on twice in 15 years of careless walking. 2 riders came through it single file, torches held high, unaware that the trail narrowed the way it did, until the lead horse's front hoof found nothing but air where solid ground should have been. The animal screamed and scrambled, and the rider went off sideways into the snowbank, and the second horse, spooked by the first, reared hard enough to send its own rider tumbling, before either man had fired a single shot. 2 more down. Neither dead, most likely, but neither in any shape to keep climbing either. A third rider had circled wide of the trail entirely, cautious where his companions had been careless, and Amos heard him. Before, he saw him the particular creak of saddle leather, moving slow and deliberate through timber. A man was trying hard not to disturb. Amos went still against the trunk of a pole pine, breath held, and let the rider pass close enough that he could have reached out and touched the horse's flank if he'd wanted to. He didn't want to, not yet, because the man was circling toward the cabin, toward the window where Odessa knelt with the rifle, and Amos understood, with a clarity that arrived cold and total, that letting this one pass, trusting her to handle what came next entirely on her own. He trusted her. That surprised him some, even in the middle of everything else that night, how completely and immediately he trusted her to handle it. He let the rider go, and moved instead toward the fourth position, the narrow gap in the fence line where a man on foot might try to slip past the barn unseen, because a good defense wasn't about being everywhere. It was about knowing which ground mattered most, and trusting the rest to hold on its own. Down at the cabin, Odessa knelt at the window with the rifle steadied on the sill, watching the dark for shapes that shouldn't be there, and doing the only other thing she knew how to do under fire. She was talking to herself. Fast. Under her breath. Because if I stop talking, I'm going to start thinking about how many bullets 6 men can fire in 1 minute, and that number is not a number I want in my head right now. A shape moved at the fence line. She fired the warning shot into the snow 6 feet wide of it, the way Amos had told her, and the shape dropped flat and didn't rise again. And she thought, well, that worked. That actually worked. Which is more than I expected from a woman who has never in her life fired a gun before tonight. Except the thought didn't finish, because a second shape came around the north corner of the barn, closer, faster, and this one did not stop when she called out. She fired the real shot. The man went down with a cry that cut off sharp in the middle, and Odessa's whole body went cold, and still, rifle still smoking in her hands, and some old voice in the back of her skull said very calmly, "You have just shot a man." And she thought, back at it, just as calm, yes. And I will do it again if he gets back up. Because that is what tonight is. That is simply what tonight has become. My father spent 30 years teaching me how to make things grow. Nobody ever taught me this. And yet here I am, doing it anyway because the alternative was letting them take what we built. Otto Berg fought like a man settling an old debt, because that was, in the truest sense, exactly what he was doing. He'd taken up a position behind the woodpile, with an old shotgun that had seen better decades, and when 2 riders came around the east side of the barn together, torches high, confident, expecting no resistance from a farmer they'd never once considered. A threat Otto stood up out of the dark and fired both barrels in quick succession, and both men went down off their horses, before either one had time to understand what had happened to them. "That's for the firewood I brought under false pretenses," Otto muttered, reloading with hands that shook only a little. "And that one's for every supper I ate at his table while lying to his face." Because guilt, it turned out, made a man reckless in exactly the ways that sometimes kept other people alive. He caught movement at the tree line, a 7th shape he hadn't counted before, and swung the shotgun around, and found himself staring at nothing more than a spooked deer bolting for cover, and let out a breath that was half relief and half a laugh. He didn't have room in his chest for tonight. By his own rough count, standing there in the snow with his heart going too fast and his reloaded shotgun steady in his hands, that left one man still climbing that he hadn't accounted for. It was Jed Wicklow, who finally reached the cabin door. Amos hadn't expected him, hadn't thought about him in weeks. If he was honest, had assumed the man had drifted off to whatever gutter claimed men like him eventually. But there he was, thinner than before, eyes gone hollow and desperate in a way that told its own story, before he ever opened his mouth. "Sloan's got men outside your barn already down," Wicklow said, breathing hard, pistol shaking in his grip. "And he told me if I didn't finish this myself, my debt to him gets called tonight instead. Every dollar. And a man collects on debts like that in ways that don't leave much of you standing afterward." Amos came around the corner of the porch, rifle raised, steady despite everything in him that wanted to shake. "Put it down, Wicklow. Can't." His voice cracked on the word. "You don't know what he'll—" "I know exactly what he'll do," Amos said. "I know what he's already done. 8 to my wife. To my son. You want to talk about debts? Wicklow, I've got one older than yours, and I intend to collect it tonight, too." Wicklow's eyes went to the window, to Odessa, framed there, rifle still in her hands. watching him with an expression that held no fear in it anymore, only a kind of tired, furious clarity. "I'm sorry," Wicklow said to her, of all people, in a voice gone suddenly young and small. "I never should have. I didn't know what I had, taking you off that road. I didn't know what you were." "You knew I was a person," Odessa said, flat and clear through the window glass. "That was always enough to know." Wicklow's hand shook harder. The pistol came up anyway, aimed past Amos, toward the window, toward her, because a debt was a debt, and a desperate man does desperate arithmetic when the alternative is worse. Amos moved. He didn't think about it. There wasn't time to think about it. He simply put himself between the barrel and the window, and the shot that was meant for Odessa Marsh caught him instead, low in the shoulder, spinning him half around before the pain even had time to announce itself properly. He hit the porch boards hard. The world went white at the edges, the way it does, and Amos lay there a moment, listening to his own blood roaring in his ears, thinking, distant and strange, so this is what it feels like. Didn't expect it to feel this administrative, like paperwork, like something being processed. Except then, the pain arrived in full, and there was nothing administrative about it at all. He heard Odessa's voice before he saw her face, high and cracked, and nothing at all like her usual steady calm. She was on her knees beside him on the porch, both hands pressed hard against his shoulder, and above them, somewhere close, another shot rang out, and Wicklow's pistol clattered onto the boards, and Wicklow himself made a sound Amos didn't have the strength left to place. "Stay with me," Odessa said. "Amos, look at me. You do not get to leave in the middle of a sentence, do you hear me? I am not finished with you yet." "Wasn't planning," he managed, and the rest of it dissolved into a wet cough that scared them both. "Stop talking. You keep saying that. Because you keep not listening." Her voice broke clean through the middle of the second word, and he watched her fight it back down, watched her force her hands steady against his shoulder, even while everything else about her was shaking. "You are going to be fine. Do you hear me? You are going to be entirely fine. Because I did not rebuild 3 years of dead ground just to bury a husband in it before the first real harvest." Above them, on the porch, Wicklow stood frozen over his own dropped pistol, hands raised, staring at the barrel of Otto Berg's reloaded shotgun with the particular stillness of a man who has run out of every option except surrender. "Don't," Wicklow said. "Please. I didn't want any of this. He had my note, my whole debt. He said if I didn't, save it for the marshal," Otto said grim. "There's one riding up this mountain right now, unless I badly misjudge how fast federal men move once somebody finally sends for them." Which turned out to be exactly true, because Otto Berg 3 days earlier, bleeding and half convinced he was about to be turned away from Amos Judd's door forever, had ridden the long way down to the territorial marshal's office in the valley the very same night, and had laid out everything he knew about Warwick Sloane's mining ledgers and his forged land claims, and the debts he collected in ways no honest court would ever recognize. It had taken 3 days for the marshal to move on it. It had taken exactly the wrong 3 days to matter to the men bleeding in Amos Judd's snow tonight, but it had not taken too long to matter at all. The federal marshal's name was Dawes, and he arrived with 4 deputies just past 2 in the morning, riding hard up a mountain road that had, within the past hour, gone from a battlefield to something closer to a graveyard, with the lucky ones still breathing. He found Warwick Sloane's remaining men either fled, or face down in the snow, or sitting with their hands raised against the barn wall under Otto Berg's watchful shotgun. He found Jed Wicklow already disarmed and shaking, muttering something about a debt and a man named Sloane, who'd promised to forgive it in exchange for one simple thing that had gone terribly, permanently wrong. And he found Amos Judd on the porch, shoulders soaked through, being held together quite literally, in that moment by a woman who refused, flatly, to let go of him even when the marshal's own men tried gently to move her aside so they could work. "Ma'am," Dawes said, "we need to get him to the doctor." "Then get the doctor here," Odessa said without looking up, "because I am not letting go of this shoulder until somebody better qualified than me is pressing on it instead." Which was, in its own way, exactly the sort of thing that made the marshal's deputies exchange a glance and decide wisely not to argue with her. Doc Whitfield arrived within the hour, dragged out of retirement and out of bed by a rider Otto had sent ahead, and he took one look at the wound and said, in the flat professional tone of a man who'd said it many times before and always meant as good news, through and through, clean enough, "He'll live, if infection stays out of it." "He'll live," Odessa repeated, like she needed to hear the shape of the words out loud before she believed them. Rest and no infection, and he'll have most of the movement back in that arm eventually. Maybe not all of it. Whitfield glanced at her, then at Amos. Half conscious but tracking the conversation well enough to manage a week. I'll do what I'm told. You will not, Whitfield said, not unkindly. But we'll try anyway. Warwick Sloane himself was found at his mine office 2 valleys over, calm, composed, already burning papers in his stove, when Marshal Dawes and his deputies arrived to place him under arrest. He did not resist, did not raise his voice. He simply set down the papers he hadn't yet managed to feed to the fire, and folded his hands and asked, with the mild irritation of a man inconvenienced rather than caught, what exactly he was being charged with. Land fraud, to begin with, Dawes told him. We'll add to the list as we work through what's left in that stove of yours. I run a legitimate mining operation. You ran a great many things, Mr. Sloane. Legitimate wasn't the operating principle behind most of them, from what my investigations turned up so far. Dawes nodded to a deputy who began methodically pulling ledgers from the shelves behind Sloane's desk. Otto Berg gave us enough 3 nights back to justify the warrant that got us up that mountain in time. Everything we're finding since just keeps confirming he undersold how deep it ran. Sloane's jaw worked once, the only outward sign, in that whole exchange, that anything about the situation troubled him in the slightest. Berg, he said flat. Man had a debt to you. Seems he finally decided the interest you were charging on it cost more than he was willing to keep paying. Dawes gestured for his men to finish the search. You'll have your chance to answer all of it in Helena, in front of a judge who, I'm told, doesn't much care for men who think money settles every question a law might otherwise ask. Dawes had a list. It was, as it turned out, a considerable list. Land fraud, spanning 6 separate homesteads across 3 counties. Forged territorial claims, the same handwriting traced across 4 years of falsified sales. Bribery of 2 former land clerks, both already dismissed from their positions once Otto's information had reached the right ears. Conspiracy to commit murder, rising directly from the events of that night on Amos Judd's mountain. And, sitting near the bottom of a growing stack of evidence, Dawes's men would spend the next several weeks assembling a set of mining company ledgers, recovered from Sloane's own office, detailing tailings runoff, diverted into the old creek route some 8 winters back. In the same season, some fevers had swept through 4 households along that water and left one mountain man burying a wife and a son on the ridge above his cabin. Doc Whitfield was called to testify to what he remembered of that winter, and he was careful, on the stand, in exactly the way he'd been careful with Amos that afternoon, at his own kitchen table, clear that he had seen the runoff himself, clear that the pattern of sickness had followed the water, rather than any other explanation he'd ever been offered, and equally clear, under a defense attorney's pointed questioning, that no doctor of his era possessed the means to prove beyond all doubt that one single thing had caused another across the distance of 8 years. It did not in the end matter quite so much as Amos had once imagined it would need to. The ledgers did not, and could never, prove beyond all doubt that the fever which took Rebecca and their son traced directly back to that same tainted water. Amos understood that plainly by the time the trial concluded, and made his peace with understanding it, in a way that felt less like defeat than like simply setting down a weight he'd been carrying wrong. But the ledgers proved something else entirely, something that turned out to matter just as much in its own way they proved. Sloane had known, at the time, exactly what his own operation was doing to that water, and had made a considered, documented decision that the cost of doing it, honestly, wasn't worth the money it would save him to keep quiet instead. That was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all there had ever going to be. Amos, when he was well enough to hear the full account of it, from Marshal Dawes at his own kitchen table 3 weeks later, sat a long while without saying anything at all. 8 years, he said finally. I buried them under a word, fever. Like fever was just weather. Like nobody was ever responsible for any of it. Somebody was, Dawes said. Whether the law can prove the whole of it or not, somebody was. And he's going to answer for what we can prove now. Might not undo what's already done, Mr. Judd. But it isn't nothing either. No, Amos said quiet. I don't suppose it is. Dawes lingered a while longer after that, finishing his coffee, and before he rode back down the mountain, he set one more thing on the table between them, a short list, handwritten, of the 4 other households along that same stretch of creek who'd lost somebody that terrible winter. Thought you'd want their names. Dawes said. Wasn't only your family that water touched. Might be some comfort in knowing you weren't alone in it, even if it took 8 years for anybody to say so plain. Amos read the names slow, one at a time, and recognized 2 of them families who'd moved on from the valley not long after that winter, unable to stay on ground that had cost them so much, their homesteads long since sold or abandoned to weather. He hadn't thought of them in years, hadn't let himself think of much from that season at all, beyond his own 2 graves on the ridge. Might write to whichever of them can still be found, he said. Let them know what the ledgers turned up. Seems the kind of thing a person ought to hear plain, even this late. Seems it does, Dawes agreed, and left him to the list, and to whatever he intended to do with it. The trial itself, held weeks later in Helena, before a federal judge with a reputation for being entirely unpurchasable, did not require Amos to testify at length. His shoulder, still healing, still aching every time the weather turned, kept him seated for most of it. It was Odessa's testimony that carried the weight of the courtroom, clear, exact, impossible to shake, what laying out the forged documents and the fraudulent sales and the 8-year pattern of a man who had built his fortune on the desperation of people too poor to fight back. Otto testified too, plainly, without excusing himself for any of it, laying out the debt and the reporting, and the night he'd finally chosen to ride the other direction instead. The prosecutor had warned him, beforehand, that his own conduct might draw scrutiny alongside Sloane's. Otto had said simply that he'd rather answer for the truth in open daylight than keep carrying it around in the dark, and had taken the stand regardless. Jed Wicklow testified as well. Under a separate arrangement the prosecutor had worked out in exchange for his cooperation, and his testimony proved more useful to the case than anyone had expected from a man who'd spent the whole of his adult life avoiding anything resembling accountability. He described, plainly and without excusing himself, the debt Sloane had held over him, the years of small jobs and smaller threats that had kept him circling the edges of Sloane's operation, long before he'd ever sat down at a poker table in the Broken Spur. He would serve his own sentence, shorter than Sloane's, for his part in the kidnapping and the events of that night on the mountain, and he asked, at the close of his testimony, if he might say one further thing the court hadn't specifically asked him to say. The judge, unusual for a man of his reputation, allowed it. Wicklow looked, for a long moment, at Odessa, seated near the front of the gallery, with her hands folded in her lap the same steady way they'd been folded that first night on the saloon floor. I took something from her that wasn't mine to take, he said, voice rough. Her freedom. First, her father's work after that. I can't give either one back the way it was before I took it. I know that, but I wanted it said plain, in a room where it'll be written down and kept, that what I did was wrong, and that she was never anything less than a person the whole time I was busy treating her like she wasn't one. Nobody in the courtroom laughed. Nobody in the courtroom, for once, had anything glib to offer at all. Sloane's own attorney called only 2 witnesses in his defense, both of them men from Helena's business community, who spoke to his standing in the territory and his contributions to its development, and neither of whom, under the prosecutor's cross-examination, could offer any account of where Sloane's fortune had actually originated, beyond vague talk of shrewd investment and hard work. Sloane himself did not take the stand. His attorney had advised against it, and for once, Sloane had taken advice rather than issuing it, sitting through the whole of the proceedings, with his hands folded and his expression unreadable, the same composed stillness he'd worn since the morning of his arrest. Sloane was convicted on 11 separate counts. He was sentenced to 18 years in a federal penitentiary, and he sat through the reading of it with the particular stillness of a man who has spent months slowly understanding that the ground he built his whole life upon was never as solid as he'd assumed, and that understanding it had not made him smaller. It had only made him harder, calcified around a grievance that would define whatever years remained to him. Amos stood outside the courthouse afterward, hat in both hands, working through something he could not quite name. "It's over," Odessa said beside him. "Most of it." He looked at her. "Doesn't bring them back." "No," she said gently. "It doesn't. Nothing was ever going to. But it stops him from doing it to anybody else's family. That matters too, even if it doesn't feel like enough standing here today." He thought about that a long while, walking with her toward the waiting wagon, the Rocky Mountains standing white-capped behind Helena's rooftops. "My father used to say," Odessa added, That people who spend all their time mourning the topsoil already lost tend to miss the subsoil that's still there, ready to be worked. He say that a lot? Constantly. Drove me half to distraction as a girl. A pause softer. Understood it a great deal better once I'd lost something myself. Amos's recovery through that winter was not graceful, and he was honest enough with himself to admit it wasn't going to be. He was not a man built for sitting still, not even under the best of conditions, and the specific texture of being genuinely useless, unable to split wood, unable to work the field, reduced to small tasks with his good hand while his shoulder knit itself back together at its own stubborn pace, wore on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. You have recoiled that rope 4 times, Odessa observed one evening, not glancing up from her ledger. There's a kink near the... There is no kink. I checked. Twice. He set the rope down, looked at his hands, the scar already pulling tight and pale across the top of his shoulder where Whitfield had stitched him closed. I don't like being useless, he said again, because apparently it was a thing he needed to keep saying until it stopped being true. You aren't useless. She finally looked up. You are healing. Those are not the same thing, no matter how loudly your pride insists otherwise. He almost smiled. Almost. Because that was the thing about Odessa Marsh she had, once in all the months he'd known her, let him get away with confusing the two. Something had shifted between them too, over the course of that hard winter, in ways neither of them rushed to name out loud. It had started, if Amos ever traced it back honestly, somewhere around the 3rd or 4th night she'd sat up with him through the worst of the shoulder pain, her hand finding his in the dark without either of them discussing when that had become a habit worth keeping. By February, he'd stopped pretending the loft was anything other than where he kept his spare clothes. By March, neither of them bothered pretending at all. You're staring, Odessa said one evening, not looking up from her ledger, though something in the set of her mouth suggested she didn't much mind being stared at. Man's allowed to look at his own wife. Man's allowed. Doesn't mean the wife in question isn't trying to finish a column of figures. Finish it then. He didn't look away. I've got nowhere else I'd rather be looking. She glanced up at that finally, something warm and slightly startled crossing her face, the particular expression of a woman who had spent a great deal of her life being looked past, or looked through, or looked at only long enough to be judged and dismissed, and who still, after everything, hadn't entirely grown accustomed to being looked at, simply because somebody wanted to. You're going to make me lose count, she said, but she was smiling when she said it, and she let him keep looking a good while longer, before either of them remembered there was supper still needing tending to. Odessa did not speak for a long while about the man she had shot that night by the barn. Amos noticed the silence around it, the way he'd learned to notice most things about her by then, not by what she said, but by the particular shape of what she carefully didn't. It surfaced on a night in late January, nearly a year to the week since he'd first won her at that card table, when he woke to find her sitting bolt upright beside him, breathing hard, staring at nothing in the dark. Odessa. I'm all right. Her voice didn't sound all right. Go back to sleep. You were dreaming. I was remembering. There's a difference, and the difference doesn't make it easier to sit with, whatever the doctors in Philadelphia like to claim about it. She pulled her knees up, arms wrapped around them, and for a long while she said nothing further, and he let her have the silence, because he understood by then that some things couldn't be rushed out of a person any more than lime could be rushed into acid soil. I still hear the sound he made, she said eventually, the one by the barn. I didn't know a person could make a sound like that until I heard it come out of somebody. I'd put a bullet into myself. I keep waiting to feel sorry about it, properly sorry. The way I think a decent person ought to feel, and mostly what I feel instead is that I'd do it again tomorrow if it meant you and Otto and I were still breathing at the end of it. I don't know what that says about me. Says you're a person who did what needed doing, in a night, that offered you nothing better to do it with. He reached over, careful, and found her hand in the dark. Doesn't make you less decent for doing it. Makes you honest about the cost, which is more than most men manage. She was quiet a while longer, her hand steady in his despite everything else about that hour that wasn't. My father never had to make a choice like that, she said finally. Spent his whole life coaxing things to grow. I don't think he'd have known what to do with a night like the one we had. Maybe not. But I expect he'd have understood why you did what you did all the same. Man who spent 30 years defending ground nobody else believed in would understand defending people the same way, given the need for it. She didn't answer that directly, but her breathing slowed, eventually, and her hand loosened in his, and toward morning she slept again, and he lay awake a while, longer, keeping watch over that sleep the way he'd once, a lifetime, and a whole winter ago, kept watch over the sound of another person breathing in his cabin for the first time. There were harder nights than that, in the thick of that winter, nights his shoulder ached badly enough that sleep wouldn't come regardless of how tired the rest of him was, and Odessa took to sitting up with him on those nights, rather than leaving him to it alone in the dark. She read to him sometimes, from her father's notebooks, the passages that weren't formulas or field notes but simply Elias Marsh thinking out loud on paper about the particular stubbornness of ground everyone else had abandoned. Amos found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he liked the sound of a dead man's careful handwriting, read aloud in his wife's voice, better than he'd ever liked the sound of silence, which had been, for the better part of 8 years, the only company he'd trusted. "He'd have liked you," Odessa said one such night, setting the notebook aside. "My father. He didn't warm to many people. Found most men either too certain of themselves or not certain enough of anything at all. You'd have confused him, I think. He'd never have known which kind you were. Which kind am I? Both, depending on the day," she said, and there was real fondness in it, enough that he let the observation sit rather than arguing with it, because arguing with it would have meant admitting how much it had settled something in him to hear it said plainly. Otto Berg came by most days that winter, no longer out of guilt, or debt, or obligation to a man he'd once betrayed for money he couldn't repay any other way. He came because the two of them had become, somewhere in the middle of everything that had nearly gotten them both killed, something closer to family than either man had expected to find again at this stage of his life. "You didn't have to ride down that mountain in the dark," Amos told him once. Watching Otto split wood, he still couldn't manage himself. "Could have stayed clear of the whole business. Let it play out without you." "Could have," Otto agreed, setting the axe down. "Chose not to. A man's got to decide, eventually, which mistakes he's going to spend the rest of his life carrying, and which ones he's going to actually try and fix, while there's still time left to fix them." He looked over, steady. "You forgave me a debt I hadn't finished paying yet. Figured the least I owed you was finishing it properly." "Consider it finished," Amos said. "Don't rush me," Otto said, and for the first time in a long while, both men laughed together. Easy, the way friends laugh when the worst of something has finally passed clean through and left something sturdier standing in its place. Peter Berg, grown broader and steadier over the course of that year than his father seemed entirely prepared for, took to riding up most Saturdays to handle whatever heavy work Amos's shoulder still refused, and never once made a show of doing it, which Amos noticed and appreciated more than he ever said aloud. Word of the trial's outcome reached the valley within days, and what followed surprised Amos more than nearly anything else that whole difficult year had managed to surprise him. A dozen wagons came up the mountain road on a clear Saturday not long after, loaded with lumber and nails and more hands than the job strictly required, because Ingrid Halverson had decided, without consulting anyone in particular, that a barn shot up in a gunfight deserved proper mending before another winter set in, and that the valley owed the Judd homestead at least that much for everything it had been given back in return. Amos stood at the edge of his own yard that morning, shoulders still slung, watching Otto direct the framing crew and Mr. Ashford hauling lumber alongside Peter Berg and Greta Berg, organizing a table of food that seemed to have appeared from nowhere in particular, and felt something in his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for, though he'd grown considerably better this past year at sitting with feelings before he rushed to name them. "You look like a man who doesn't know what to do with himself," Odessa said, coming to stand beside him, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "Don't rightly know what to call this," he admitted. "Never had a barn raised around me before. Never had cause to. It's called Neighbors," she said. "I understand the concept was somewhat foreign to you before this year." "Somewhat," he agreed, and let her lean into his good side, while the whole valley worked together in his yard, hammers going steady against the cold, bright morning, and thought that if anybody had told him, this time last winter, that he'd end up standing here watching this happen on his own land, he'd have told them plainly they had the wrong man in mind. The guide was finished that same winter, in the evenings, at the wide table Amos had built with his own 2 hands, Months before any of this had happened back when a bigger table for correspondence had still been a joke between them, rather than a genuine necessity. Odessa wrote most mornings before whatever fieldwork the season allowed, and some nights after Amos had gone to sleep, working through her father's recovered notebooks, and her own hard-won additions from a full season proving them true on ground everyone else had written off. Having the notebooks back changed the work considerably. There were formulas in them she'd only half remembered correctly, refinements her father had made in his final 2 years of field work that she hadn't been present to witness firsthand. There were soil classifications specific to the northern mountain territories that existed nowhere else, in no other book, in no other living mind, besides the one now bent over the pages at that wide table each morning. What emerged read nothing like the dry official pamphlets the Territorial Land Office distributed. It was organized by the actual conditions a struggling frontier farmer encountered: poor drainage, acidic soil, seasons too short, and altitudes too high for anything ordinary to survive in. And it was honest, in a way official documents rarely bothered to be, about the fact that not every method worked on every piece of ground, and that failure was simply information, not a verdict. The printer in Bozeman, a man named Theodore Marsh, no relation, a coincidence that made Odessa laugh out loud. The first time she read his letter, agreed to an initial run of 300 copies after a 2-day visit to the homestead that left him, by his own admission, more impressed with the manuscript than with anything he'd printed in a decade. "You negotiated the whole contract yourself," Amos said, reading over her shoulder. "Of course I did," Odessa said, not looking up from the page she was correcting. "Did you imagine I wouldn't?" He hadn't. Not really. He'd simply not been present to see it happen, having spent most of Marsh's visit out checking fence with a shoulder that still complained about cold mornings, and had come in each time to find Odessa deep in some technical discussion about print quality and distribution that she navigated with the same precision she brought to everything else. "You should have been a lawyer," he told her. "My father said the same. He also said the law wouldn't have me." At the time, that was almost certainly true. She glanced up, something dry and warm moving behind her eyes. "Things they do," Amos agreed. The guide was printed that same spring, 300 copies bound in plain brown cloth, the title stamped in black across the cover: "Working Ground: A Practical Guide to Frontier Soils of the Northern Mountain Territories," by Odessa Marsh Judd, based on the research of Dr. Elias Marsh. She opened the first copy at the kitchen table, holding it carefully, the way a person holds something they've worked toward for a very long time, and are half afraid might change shape if pressed too hard. She turned to the dedication page, one she'd written alone, late at night, and had not shown him beforehand, for Elias Marsh, who believed no ground was ever truly beyond help, and for Amos, who proved it could still hold something worth growing. He read it standing over her shoulder, and cleared his throat, and went to get more coffee, neither of them particularly needed, because it gave his hands something to do besides, show her exactly how much that single line had undone him. Letters began arriving that spring from as far away as the Dakotas, addressed simply to the Judd homestead, care of the author of Working Ground, and Odessa answered every single one of them at that same wide table, in the mornings, with her coffee going cold beside her, while her pen moved in that careful, unhurried hand. One letter, arriving later than the rest that season, came not from a struggling farmer but from a woman in Denver, who wrote that she'd read the book at the urging of a mutual acquaintance and wished to say plainly that she had once known a woman, fitting Odessa's description, years back, through her late husband's correspondence with a certain traveling botanist. She wondered whether the author might be the same Miss Marsh she recalled hearing of, and if so, wished her to know that her father's name was still spoken of with respect in certain scientific circles back east, circles that would very likely be glad to learn his work had, after all, found its way into print. Odessa read that letter 3 times before setting it aside, and did not answer it for the better part of a week, turning the possibility over slowly, the way she turned over most things that mattered. "You don't have to write back," Amos told her, watching her carry the letter to the wide table and away from it again several evenings running without ever quite committing pen to paper. "I know I don't have to." "Then what's stopping you?" She was quiet a long moment. "My father spent 30 years being taken seriously by exactly the sort of circles that letter describes, and I spent most of my life standing just outside those circles, listened to only because I happened to be his daughter, rather than because anyone particularly wanted to hear what I thought myself. I don't know that I'm eager to go back to being measured by whether they approve of me now, even secondhand, even this many years later. Don't have to be measured by anybody's approval to know the work's good, Amos said. You've got a valley full of families with better harvests than they had 2 years back. Who could tell you that plainer than any paupersa back east ever could? She considered that, and something in her shoulders eased. She wrote back, eventually, a short and businesslike reply that neither invited nor discouraged further correspondence, and left it at that, which seemed, to Amos, exactly the right note to leave it on. By early summer, 4 farming families across the valley families, who had once looked at Amos Judd with pity, or suspicion, or outright dismissal, were planting crops they'd never attempted before, on ground they'd once been actively planning to abandon. The Ashford place, gypsum worked into its compacted clay the previous autumn, showed the first honest green it had produced in 3 seasons. Otto's own bottomland, following methods Odessa had refined specifically for his particular stretch of poor drainage, looked, by his own grudging admission, better than it had any right to look this early in the year. Amos and Odessa rode down to the Ashford place in June, at young Mrs. Ashford's own invitation, to see for themselves what a season of honest ground could produce. They found the family standing at the edge of a field thick with the first real crop the property had grown since they'd taken it over. Mr. Ashford turning a handful of soil over in his palm the same unconscious way I watched Odetta do it 2 years running now, like the gesture had become as natural to him as breathing. Wasn't sure I believed it would work, he admitted, looking out over grass that had no business growing so thick on ground he'd nearly abandoned 3 winters back. Told my wife I was humoring you, mostly, because you'd been kind enough to ride all this way, and it seemed rude to refuse the advice outright. And now? Now I've got a harvest I didn't have to imagine into being. Now I've got a future on this land instead of a countdown to the season we finally give up and sell it for whatever we can get. He looked at Odessa, something plain and grateful in his face that didn't need any further words put around it. Don't rightly know how a person thanks somebody poor for that, Mrs. Judd. Feels like whatever I could say would come up short of the actual size of it. You could tell your neighbors, Odessa said. That's thanks enough. The whole of what I'm trying to do only matters if it keeps traveling past this one field. Riding home that evening, the mountains gone gold and rose with the particular late light of a Montana summer, Amos found himself thinking that he'd witnessed, over the course of one difficult year, something considerably larger than the survival of his own homestead. He'd watched an entire stretch of struggling country slowly turn itself around, one honest conversation at a time, and he understood plainly that none of it would have happened at all if he hadn't sat down at a poker table on a cold January night with $9 and a stubborn, unexamined refusal to let one more person get finished in front of him without doing something about it. Amos rode up to the ridge one morning that same summer, alone, before the day's work started, and stood a long while at the 2 markers cut with his own unsteady hand 8 years and a handful of months back. He hadn't come with anything particular to say this time. Simply came to stand there a while, the way a man visits an old friend he no longer needs to apologize to for the distance between visits. Trials finished, he said eventually, quiet, more for the shape of saying it out loud than because he thought either marker needed telling. Man's answering for what he did, near as the law could manage to make him answer for it. Won't ever be enough. Don't imagine I expected it to be. He turned his hat over once in his hands. Got married again, if you can believe that. Didn't imagine I'd ever say those words again in my life, and here I am saying them to you plain as anything. He paused. She'd have liked you both, I think. And you'd have liked her. Ornery as anything, and twice as smart as most men she's ever had cause to argue with. Reminds me some of what I used to be, before I forgot how. He stood there a good while longer, the wind moving easy through the grass that had grown up thick around both markers that summer, softer than it had ever grown in all the years before. And when he finally turned back down toward the cabin, he did not feel lighter exactly. He felt, instead, like a man who had finally set a weight down in the right place rather than simply carrying it differently than before. On a warm July morning, standing at the edge of his own field with rye grown chest-high on ground that had refused him for 3 straight years, before Odessa Marsh ever set foot on it, Amos stood a long while and simply looked. Odessa came to stand beside him, arms crossed, studying the same green rose. Second printing's nearly sold through, she said after a while. Marsh wrote last week. Says he's fielding requests from as far as the Dakota Territory now, and a fellow in Denver's asking about rights to print a version of it for the Southern Ranges. That's so. It is. I told him. I'd need to revise certain sections before I'd agree to anything wider than this territory. What works at this elevation won't hold true everywhere, and I won't have my name on advice that gets some ranchers whole season wrong because I let ambition outrun accuracy. She glanced at him. Might mean another winter's worth of writing. If I take it on properly. Take it on, then. We'll build a bigger table again if we need to. Well, she said. Yeah, he said. They stood there together a good while longer. A hawk turned slow circles over the far tree line. The mountains held that particular deep blue of high summer, the kind that never looks entirely real until a person has lived long enough beneath it to trust it. My father would have wanted to see this, she said finally. I expect he did, Amos said. Through you. She was quiet a moment. That's a sentimental thing to say. I'm allowed the occasional sentiment, he said. Married now. Comes with the territory. Something that was almost a laugh escaped her, unguarded, and she leaned into his good side, careful of the shoulder that would ache every winter for the rest of his life, as a permanent reminder of the night he'd stood between a bullet and the woman who'd once been sold across a poker table like she was worth nothing at all. It had been the better part of a year and a half since that cold January night in the Broken Spur, by his own rough count, and he was closing in on 40 now, in a way that would have startled him to hear said aloud, a few winters back, when he hadn't much cared to keep track of his own age at all, let alone imagine having reason to look forward to the next year of it. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 15 years losing a slow argument with hard ground, and had only recently begun, against every reasonable expectation, to win it, and standing there in his own field, on a summer morning that asked nothing more of him than to simply be present in it. Amos Judd found himself thinking back, the way he still did most days without quite meaning to that cold night in a saloon that smelled of tobacco and regret, and a woman on the floor with rope on her wrists, being so like she was worth less than the coin on the table because of nothing more than the shape God had given her. He'd told people, when people asked, that he'd simply seen somebody who needed a place to stand. That was the truest short version of it he'd ever managed to give. The fuller truth, the one he mostly kept to himself, was that he had looked at her that night and recognized something. Not pity. Recognition. A person diminished by things that had nothing to do with who they actually were, still present underneath all of it, still whole, in some buried place the world hadn't managed to reach yet. He had wanted, badly, and without fully understanding why until much later, for that place in her to have somewhere safe to stand, while it remembered itself. He hadn't rescued her. He understood that plainly now, in a way he hadn't the first night, when the whole territory had wanted to tell the story as something simpler and more dramatic than it had ever actually been. He had given her a place to stand, and she had done the rest of it herself, entirely, out of everything she already was, her father's daughter, her own hard years of careful learning, her flat refusal to let what the world said about her become the last word on who she was. He had gotten back, in the end, at least as much as he'd ever given. He knew that plainly, standing here, her weight warm against his good shoulder, and the whole valley green and living below them. The Montana sky above them did what it always did, vast and cold and entirely indifferent to everything small and human happening underneath it. It did not care about Amos Judd, or Odessa Marsh, or a stretch of rye growing on a mountain everyone in 3 counties had once sworn could never grow a single honest thing. But beneath that same indifferent sky, on ground worked with patience and real understanding, and something that had started, one cold night, as nothing more than one lonely man deciding to stay in a game he'd had every reasonable excuse to walk away from, things were growing now that had never grown there before. Not luck. Just 2 people, each broken in their own particular way, discovering that the ground between them was worth every difficult, ordinary morning it took to keep working it. Otto rode up that same evening, unannounced, the way he'd taken to doing most weeks by then, and found them still standing at the edge of the field, as the light went from gold to the deep blue that settled over the valley once the sun finally dropped behind the western ridge. Greta sent bread, he said, by way of greeting, holding up a cloth-wrapped loaf like it explained the visit entirely, which, in its own way, it did. Greta always sends bread, Amos said. Greta believes bread solves most problems a person's likely to encounter in this life. I've come to find I mostly agree with her. Otto came to stand at the fence beside them, looking out over the same green rows, and was quiet a moment in the particular way of a man taking honest stock of something. Never thought I'd stand here again after that night. Told myself, riding back down that mountain in the dark, with a bullet wound of my own, and half convinced you'd never let me past your door again, that whatever came of it, I'd at least tried to fix what I'd broken. You fixed it, Amos said. Been fixed a good while now. Man likes to hear it said plain now and again, even when he already knows it. They stood together a while longer, the three of them, until Greta's bread had been properly admired, and the last of the light had gone from the peaks, and Otto finally mounted up to ride back down before full dark settled in, calling some parting joke over his shoulder that made Odessa laugh outright, unguarded, the sound of it carrying clean across the quiet field. Amos watched him go, and then turned back to look at his own land, his and Odessa's now, in every sense that mattered, on paper and off it both, and felt, standing there in the last of that summer light, something he hadn't expected to feel again in this particular lifetime. Not the absence of grief. Grief he'd come to understand didn't work that way, didn't simply vacate a man's chest once something good moved in beside it. Rebecca and the boy would always have their place in him, quiet and permanent as the two markers on the ridge above the cabin. But grief no longer sat there alone. That was the whole of what had changed. If a man wanted the truest, plainest accounting of it, grief had learned, slowly and without any particular ceremony, to share the space with something else entirely, with rye growing chest-high on ground that had once refused every seed he'd ever given it, with a friend's laughter carrying across a summer field, with a woman's hand finding his in the dark, without either of them needing to ask permission first. It was enough. It was, against every reasonable expectation, he'd carried up that mountain road on a cold January night with $9 and nothing left to lose. More than enough. Coming in? Odessa asked, already turning toward the cabin, the lamplight in the window glowing warm against the coming dark, the same way it had glowed that very first night, a lifetime and a whole winter ago, when he'd carried a stranger up this same mountain, not knowing what either of them was walking toward. In a minute, Amos said. Want to stand here a while longer first. She didn't push him on it, simply nodded and left him to it, the way she'd learned to leave him to certain things when a man needed a private moment with whatever he was working through. He stood there until the last of the light was gone, and the first stars had come out hard and cold over the peaks, the way they always did up here, indifferent and constant, and entirely unbothered by anything a man might be feeling underneath them. And then he turned, finally, and walked back toward the warm window, and the woman waiting inside it, and did not look back at the field again, because he had learned, this past year and a half, exactly what was waiting for him there in the morning, and he no longer needed to look at it in the dark to believe it would still be growing when the sun came up.